She was barefoot on a highway in the middle of a storm, still wearing a wedding dress. Not walking, surviving. Behind her, a church full of people waited for a bride who would never come back. Ahead of her, darkness, rain, and nothing else. What happens when the woman who escaped the worst night of her life collapses at the feet of a man who stopped believing in anything worth saving? This is not a love story about perfect people. This is the story of two broken people who somehow didn't break each other. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end. You'll want to. The storm hit Millbrook County around 8:15 that evening. Not the kind of storm that builds slowly and gives you time to pull over and wait it out. The kind that drops from nowhere. One minute the sky is a bruised purple. The next, the rain is coming down so hard it sounds like gravel hitting the windshield. Mason Sterling had been driving these back roads for 12 years. He knew every curve, every dip, every stretch of broken asphalt that the county never bothered to fix. He knew the exact bend where the tree line opened up and gave you a clear view of the valley below, lit up at night like someone had scattered coins across a black cloth. He wasn't looking at the view tonight. He was thinking about the meeting he'd just left. 3 hours of listening to men in suits argue about a development deal that should have taken 40 minutes to close. He was thinking about the dinner he'd promised Sophie he'd make, the spaghetti with the butter sauce she liked, and how she'd probably already eaten cereal and gone to bed because it was already past 9. He was thinking about the way his housekeeper, Mrs. Adler, had looked at him when he'd called to say he'd be late again. Not angry, just tired. The look of someone who had already adjusted her expectations so many times that she didn't bother adjusting them anymore. He was thinking about all of that when his headlights caught something white on the side of the road. He almost didn't stop. That was the honest truth, and Mason knew it. His foot tapped the brake instinctively, but his brain was already rationalizing. Deer, probably, or a plastic bag. The rain makes everything look like something it isn't. And his hands were already starting to ease back toward the gas. Then the white thing moved. He hit the brakes hard. The truck skidded on the wet asphalt, fishtailed slightly, and came to a stop about 30 yards past whatever it was. Mason sat there for a moment, heart thumping, rain hammering the roof. Then he put it in reverse. In the red glow of his taillights, he saw her. She was sitting on the gravel shoulder with her back against a guardrail, knees pulled to her chest, head down. Her dress, and it was a dress, he could see that now, something long and white and completely destroyed by rain and mud, was plastered against her like a second skin. Her hair was dark and soaking and hanging in ropes around her face. One of her shoes was gone. The other one was still hanging off her foot by a single strap. Mason got out of the truck. The rain hit him like a wall. He was soaked in about 3 seconds. "Hey," he said. He crouched down a few feet away from her, not wanting to come any closer without warning. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't look up. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, which felt like a ridiculous thing to say in the middle of nowhere in a storm, but he said it anyway. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Slowly she raised her head. Her face was a disaster. Not in the way that embarrassed him to think. It was just the truth of it. Her mascara had tracked down both cheeks in dark rivulets. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, not deep, but bleeding thinly in the rain. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes, when she finally focused on him, were a dark greenish brown, and they looked at him the way a person looks at something they don't quite believe is real. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came out in a croak. She clearly wasn't fine. "You're sitting on a guardrail in the rain," Mason said. "In a wedding dress, with one shoe." She looked down at her foot, looked at the single remaining shoe like she was noticing it for the first time. "I know," she said. "Did someone hurt you?" Something moved across her face. Not quite pain and not quite anger, because something in between, something older than either of those things. "Not tonight," she said. Mason sat back on his heels. The rain was getting worse, if that was possible. A car passed on the far lane, didn't slow down, was gone in a spray of water. "I have a truck," he said, "and I have heat, and I'm not a threat to you, though I understand you have no reason to believe that." He paused. "There's a gas station about 4 miles back if you'd rather I just drove you there." She was quiet for a long moment. I don't have any money, she said. I don't have. I left my bag, my phone, everything. She stopped, pressed her lips together like she was trying to physically hold something in. I don't have anything. Okay, Mason said. I'm serious. I have nothing. I heard you. He stood up and offered her his hand, but come on, let's get you warm. She looked at his hand for so long, he thought she was going to say no. Then she took it. She didn't tell him her name until they were in the truck with the heat running and he'd handed her the jacket from his back seat. Old canvas thing he kept for Sophie when she got cold on the drive home from soccer practice. Emily, she said. Emily Carter. Mason. She pulled the jacket around her shoulders and stared straight ahead through the windshield. The wipers were working hard and barely keeping up. You're not going to ask me what happened, she said. Not unless you want to tell me. She made a sound that might have been a laugh in different circumstances. That's a strange answer. I'm a strange person, Mason said. She glanced at him sideways. He caught it in his peripheral vision, but kept his eyes on the road. Where are you taking me? She asked. My place is about 8 minutes from here. I've got extra rooms. You can stay tonight, get dry, sleep, and figure out the rest tomorrow. He paused. Or I can take you somewhere else. Wherever you want. I just need a destination. Emily was quiet. Why? She finally asked. Why what? Why are you doing this? You don't know me. Mason thought about it for a second. He didn't want to give her a performance. He'd met enough people who were good at performances. You were alone in the rain, he said. That seemed like reason enough. The Sterling estate wasn't the kind of place you drove up to and immediately thought home. The gate was iron and old and needed painting. The driveway was gravel that popped under the tires. The house itself was large in the way that old money houses were large. Not showy, just solid, built to last several generations by someone who believed in the value of permanence. The lights in the front were on, but the upper windows were mostly dark. Emily stared at it as they pulled up. You live here alone? She asked. With my daughter, Mason said. She's 8. He saw her expression shift just slightly. Something softened in it. What's her name? Sophie. He parked and came around to her side of the truck. She'd gotten the door open herself, but hadn't managed to get out. Her legs were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with pure exhaustion. He didn't make a thing of it, just put out his hand again. She took it again. Mrs. Adler was still up. Of course she was. The woman had the survival instincts of a lighthouse keeper. She knew when a ship was coming, and she was always already standing there with a lamp. She came out of the kitchen when she heard the door, and the look on her face when she saw Emily was something Mason would remember for a long time. Not shock, exactly. Not pity. Just the immediate, efficient assessment of a woman who had raised 3 children and seen enough of the world to know that sometimes people arrived at your door looking like the worst thing that had ever happened to them. Kitchen, Mrs. Adler said. It wasn't a question. Kitchen, Mason agreed. Emily stood in the front hallway with her ruined dress dripping on the hardwood and her one remaining shoe still dangling off her foot, and looked like she was seriously considering whether this was all some kind of hallucination. I can walk, she said when Mrs. Adler moved toward her. I didn't say you couldn't, Mrs. Adler said pleasantly. The kitchen is through here, sweetheart. They sat her down at the kitchen table. Mrs. Adler, whose first name was Janet, but who no one in the house ever called Janet, produced a first aid kit, a clean towel, a pair of thick socks, and a mug of something hot that turned out to be tea with honey and a little bit of something else that smelled faintly medicinal. She cleaned the cut above Emily's eyebrow with the efficiency of a field surgeon and zero ceremony. You need stitches, Mrs. Adler said. I'm fine, Emily said. You said that out in the rain, too, Mason said from across the kitchen, where he was leaning against the counter with his arms folded. He'd changed out of his soaked shirt and was in a dry one now. It keeps not being true. Emily looked at him. Then she looked down at the mug in her hands. It's not deep enough for stitches, she said. I've had worse. Mrs. Adler and Mason exchanged a brief glance over her head. Neither of them said anything. Steri strips then, Mrs. Adler said, and got to work. Is your family looking for you? Mason asked it quietly after Mrs. Adler had gone upstairs to make up one of the guest rooms. Emily had been sitting in silence for a few minutes, both hands around the mug, staring at a fixed point on the table. Probably, she said. They're not. It's complicated. You don't have to explain. My mother will be panicking, Emily said. Her voice went flat when she said it, like a door closing. She put a lot into tonight, into making sure tonight happened. The wedding, Mason said. The wedding. She exhaled, long, slow. I've been trying to figure out how to tell her for months. I ran out of time, I guess, and instead of telling anyone, She shook her head. I just ran. Does the man you were going to marry know where you are? Her hands tightened on the mug. No, she said, and I need to keep it that way. The way she said it was very careful, very controlled, the kind of careful that comes from practice. Mason didn't push it. There's a lock on the guest room door, he said. From the inside. She looked up at him. She stopped. Thank you. There's also a phone on the nightstand if you want to call anyone. Or not. Up to you. He pushed off the counter. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's a new problem. He was almost at the kitchen door when she said his name. Mason. He turned. Emily was still sitting at the table, but she'd turned in her chair to look at him. The cut above her eye had been neatly closed with 2 small strips. The jacket was still around her shoulders. The leftover mascara under her eyes had been wiped away, but you could still see the shadow of it. Why did you really stop? She asked. Out there on the road. He thought about saying something practical, something simple. Instead, he told her the truth. I saw something white in the rain, and I almost didn't, he said. But then it moved, and I thought, you don't keep going after something moves. You don't do that. He paused. At least, I don't. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said, and he went upstairs. Mott. Sophie found her the next morning. Mason had been up since 6, going through emails he'd ignored during the drive home, waiting for the world to catch up to him. Sophie came down at 7:15 in her pajamas, with the polar bear print that she was too old for but refused to retire. Her dark hair standing up on one side from sleep, and she stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Emily was already up. She was standing at the counter in the oversized guest room, clothes Mrs. Adler had left out. A plain gray sweatshirt and a pair of drawstring pants about 4 sizes too big. And she was making toast. She turned when she heard Sophie stop. For a second, nobody said anything. Then Sophie said, You're not Mrs. Adler. No, Emily agreed. I'm Emily. Why are you in our house? Sophie, Mason said from behind her. It's okay, Emily said. She crouched down slightly so she wasn't towering over the 8-year-old. Your dad found me last night. I was lost in the rain. Sophie stared at her with the unfiltered intensity that small children deploy without mercy. You have a cut on your face, Sophie said. I do. Does it hurt? A little. Sophie considered this. Then she walked to the table and sat down in her usual chair, apparently having completed her assessment. Dad makes the eggs too runny, she announced. Do you know how to make eggs? Emily glanced over at Mason. He spread his hands in a gesture that said, Don't look at me. I do, Emily said. How do you like them? Scrambled, with cheese, but the cheese has to go in while they're still in the pan, not on top after. I know exactly what you mean, Emily said. Sophie gave a single satisfied nod. Okay, she said. You can make breakfast? Moshe. It was that easy with Sophie, and it was that hard with everything else. Emily stayed 3 days and then a week, and then the week turned into 2 weeks, and no one said anything about it directly because saying it directly would have required someone to explain what exactly was happening in Mason Sterling's house. The practical explanation was simple enough. Emily had no money, no phone. She'd refused to go back to get it, and no real plan. Her apartment was gone. She'd let the lease expire 2 months earlier when Victor had pushed the wedding timeline forward and assumed they'd be moving into his place immediately after. Her job, a poorly paid administrative position at a nonprofit, had been quietly let go while she was preparing for the wedding, because Victor had made certain suggestions to her employer about Emily no longer needing the income. She hadn't known about that until a week after she arrived at Mason's house, when she finally borrowed a phone and called her old office and was told, very apologetically, by a former coworker that the position had been filled. That was the night Mason found her sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with a cup of cold coffee in front of her and an expression on her face that he recognized as the look of someone doing inventory, not of things, of options. "Bad news?" he asked. "My job's gone," she said. "I didn't know." She picked up the coffee, realized it was cold, put it back down. "He got me fired. While I was planning the wedding, he got me. I didn't even know." Mason sat down across from her. "Victor," he said. He'd heard the name once, in passing, in one of the scattered pieces of story Emily had let fall in the last 2 weeks, enough to understand the shape of who Victor Langford was, if not the full picture. "He wanted me dependent," Emily said. "It came out very flat, like a diagnosis. I think he did it on purpose. He liked me needing him. It was this whole thing, how he was generous, how he took care of things, how I didn't need to worry." She made a small, bitter sound. "I was so stupid." "You weren't stupid," Mason said. "You don't know that. I know that manipulative people are very good at manipulating people. That's kind of the whole mechanic of it." Emily looked at him. "That's a very calm way to say it." "I'm a calm person. A beat. Mostly." "Are you?" She studied him for a second with those dark green eyes. "You seem like someone who has a lot going on underneath and keeps it very organized." Mason was quiet for a moment. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone has said about me in years," he said. Emily almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "You can stay," Mason said, "as long as you need to." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." "Why?" He'd been expecting the question. She asked it at least once a week. Why? Why are you doing this? What do you get out of this? He understood it. People who'd been burned enough times developed a reflex around kindness. They scanned it for the catch. "You make Sophie laugh," he said. "She doesn't laugh enough. I don't know how to be funny for an 8-year-old. I know how to make sure she has what she needs, and I know how to help with math homework, and I know how to show up to soccer games, but funny," he exhaled. "Her mother was funny. I never quite got there." Emily was very still. "You don't have to tss," she started. "I know," Mason said. "I'm just answering your question." Jeszcze mama si. Sophie's mother had been gone for 4 years. Her name was Claire. Mason told Emily about her on a Sunday afternoon when Sophie was at a birthday party, and the house was quiet in the way it got sometimes. Not peaceful quiet, but hollow quiet, the kind of silence that had the shape of someone missing from it. They were in the library, not a room Mason used often, but Emily had started spending time in there, and he'd found himself gravitating toward wherever she was in the house without entirely meaning to. She was reading something. He came in to check if Sophie's party pickup time was in his phone or on the wall calendar and ended up sitting down. "She was 31, he said, out of nowhere. Emily looked up. "Claire," he said. "She was 31. Aneurysm. No warning, no..." She went to sleep and didn't wake up. He looked at the floor. "Sophie was 4. She doesn't really remember her. She's got pictures and videos, but..." He stopped. "You know how that goes." "I don't," Emily said quietly. "I'm sorry, Mason." "Don't apologize. I'm not looking for..." He caught himself. "I just wanted you to understand the thing about the laugh. It's not... I wasn't trying to make you feel indebted or anything." "I didn't think that," Emily said. "Good." He looked at the bookshelf on the far wall. A bunch of Claire's books were still there. He'd never moved them. He didn't know if that was healthy or not. "She would have liked you," he said. Claire. She liked people who were honest about hard things. Emily set her book down. "I'm not sure I'm honest about very much right now," she said. "I feel like I'm still figuring out which parts of the last 5 years were real." "That's honest," Mason said. "About the not being honest." She laughed then, actual laugh, short and surprised, and then she pressed her hand over her mouth like she'd been caught doing something. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize for laughing," Mason said. "That's a rule in this house." The other man's name was Daniel Hartley. Emily told Mason about him on a Tuesday evening while they were washing up after dinner. One of those shoulder-to-shoulder kitchen moments that happen in houses where two people have started to move around each other without thinking about it. Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table behind them, intermittently asking questions about multiplication that neither of them had to think too hard about. "There were two men," Emily said, quietly enough that it was really just for Mason. "Before Victor. There was Daniel." Mason handed her a plate to dry, said nothing. "I was 24, Emily said. "I thought Daniel understood me. I thought he saw something in me that nobody else saw." She ran the dish towel over the plate. "I was right about that, actually. He did see something. He just used it." "Used it how?" "He was married," she said simply. "I didn't know. There was a whole family. I found out by accident from a friend of a friend about 8 months in." She stacked the plate in the cabinet. "He said it was complicated. He said she didn't understand him. He said all the things." She picked up another plate. "I ended it, but it broke something in me. I think I stopped believing I could read people after that." "So you went to Victor," Mason said. "I went to Victor," Emily confirmed. "He was safe in the way that men who are controlling are always safe at first. He wasn't hiding anything. He was very present, very sure about everything." She paused. "I was tired of uncertainty. Victor had no uncertainty." "Until he did," Mason said. "Until I did," Emily corrected. "He was exactly who he always was. I just finally looked at it clearly." Mason turned off the tap and leaned against the sink. "Mom, what's 7 times 8? Sophie called from the table. 56, Emily said, without missing a beat. Sophie scribbled it down. Mason looked at Emily. She was looking at the plate in her hands, not at him. But the corner of her mouth had done that thing it sometimes did, that not quite a smile that he'd started watching for without realizing he was doing it. "You're good at that," he said. "Math?" "Making her feel like you've always been here." Emily finally looked at him. Something passed across her face, something complicated and careful and real. "I'm not trying to be anything," she said. "I just like her." "I know," Mason said. "That's what I mean." She started volunteering at a community center in Millbrook that had a financial literacy program. A contact Mrs. Adler had that led to a part-time role, then a more regular one. She was good at it, better than good. She had the particular gift of being able to explain complicated things in a way that made people feel capable instead of stupid. And the people who came through those doors had often spent years being made to feel stupid by systems they didn't understand. She'd come home in the evenings with stories. The woman who'd been paying 30% interest on a department store card for a decade because nobody had ever explained how it worked. The teenager who'd taken out a predatory loan for a car and was now drowning in it. The young couple who'd been paying rent on a lease they didn't know they could negotiate. "They're not uninformed," she told Mason one evening. "They've just never had anyone treat them like they were worth the explanation." "Is that how you grew up?" Mason asked. She looked at him. Then she looked away, out the window. "My mother is very good at looking like everything is fine," she said. "We weren't fine. We were paycheck to paycheck, and sometimes not even that. But you'd never know it from the outside." She paused. "Which is partly why she wanted me to marry Victor. He was the solution to a problem she'd been managing for 30 years. "But you weren't the solution to her problem," Mason said. Emily was quiet. "No," she said finally. "I'm not." It was Sophie who first said the thing that neither of the adults in the house were saying. She was 7 weeks into Emily living there, and she said it the way children say important things, at an inconvenient time, in the middle of something else, as if it was entirely obvious. They were all three on the living room floor putting together a puzzle, a ridiculous 1,000-piece thing of a cottage in the Scottish Highlands that Sophie had requested for her last birthday and that Mason had been quietly hoping would get lost. "I want Emily to stay forever," Sophie said, not looking up from the piece she was turning over in her hands. Mason and Emily both went still. Sophie, Mason said. I know she can't stay forever, Sophie said, with the withering precision of an 8-year-old who wants credit for being realistic. I just mean for a long time. Is that okay to say? Emily looked at the puzzle. Then she looked at Sophie. I like being here, Emily said carefully. I know, Sophie said. You don't do the thing where you say you'll come back and you don't. The room was very quiet. Mason looked at his daughter. She was fitting a puzzle piece into the wrong space with the cheerful determination of someone who is going to make it work regardless. Who says they'll come back and doesn't? He asked. Dad's work people, Sophie said. They say they'll come to things and they don't. And Aunt Sarah said she was going to visit in the summer, and she didn't. She tried another piece. Emily says she'll be at dinner, and she's at dinner. Emily pressed her lips together. Mason could see her eyes were a little bright. I try to be where I say I'll be, Emily said. I know, Sophie said. That's what I meant. She fit another piece into the wrong space. Mason reached over without comment and corrected it. Sophie didn't object. I'm going to make hot chocolate, Emily said, and stood up and went to the kitchen. And if her shoulders were shaking slightly in the doorway, Mason was the only one who saw it. She called her mother on a Thursday night in the second month. Mason only knew because Mrs. Adler told him afterward, because Emily didn't bring it up and he wasn't going to ask. It didn't go well, Mrs. Adler said, with the economy of someone who'd heard enough through kitchen walls to have formed an opinion. How bad? Margaret Carter, Mrs. Adler said, which was Emily's mother's name and also apparently a complete sentence by itself. She had a lot to say about the embarrassment, about Victor. About Emily? Mrs. Adler pressed her lips together. She said the things that mothers say when they're frightened and they can't admit they're frightened, so they say other things instead. She stacked some dishes. Emily handled it. Did she cry? After she hung up. A pause. She was fine by dinner. Mason stood in the kitchen for a moment. She cried before dinner and was fine for dinner, he said. That's the woman, Mrs. Adler said, and turned on the dishwasher, which was her way of ending a conversation. The night Mason almost said something he wasn't ready to say, it was raining again. Of course it was. Millbrook County had the kind of November that erases the memory of what sun felt like. Sophie was asleep. Mrs. Adler had gone home. Mason had been in his office going through quarterly reports for a property fund he was overseeing when he heard Emily in the hallway, and then silence, and then nothing, and then he'd gotten up without knowing exactly why. She was in the front hall, standing at the window beside the door, looking out at the dark driveway, the rain coming down in sheets outside. She didn't hear him come up. He stopped a few feet behind her. Hey, he said. She turned. She'd been crying, but not recently. The kind of face where you'd cried an hour ago and washed it off, but the traces were still around the eyes. Hey, she said. Sorry, I was just... Don't, he said. Don't apologize. She turned back to the window. I keep thinking about who I was 8 weeks ago, she said. Standing in that vestibule in that dress. I had a whole plan. I was going to go through with it. I'd talked myself all the way there. She exhaled. And then I heard the music start through the door and I couldn't. What made you run? Mason asked. She was quiet for a while. There's a moment, she said, where you realize that the person you became while you were trying to survive something is not the person you actually are, and that those two people want completely different things. She pressed one finger to the glass. The rain ran down the other side. I didn't know if I'd ever get another chance to choose the right one. Mason stood beside her now, not quite shoulder to shoulder, close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her. Which one did you choose? He said. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she didn't always, that direct, unguarded look that she parceled out carefully. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still figuring out who she is. He nodded. He understood that more than she knew. Okay, he said. They stood there for a while, watching the rain come down on the dark driveway, not saying anything else. There were things building up between them. He could feel them the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. but neither of them was in a place to speak them yet, and Mason was experienced enough at loss to know that rushing anything you actually valued was how you ruined it. So they stood there, and eventually Emily said goodnight and went upstairs. And Mason stood at the window alone for a while longer. He didn't feel alone exactly. That was the thing. He couldn't have said when it had started, that particular shift from there is a guest in this house to there is someone in this house. But it had happened somewhere in the last 2 months, quietly, without ceremony. He turned off the hallway light and went upstairs. In Sophie's doorway, he paused. She was asleep on her back, arms out, one sock on and one sock gone, the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2 tucked under her arm. The nightlight threw a warm yellow shape on the wall. He stood there a little longer than necessary. Then he pulled her door almost closed and went to bed. Outside, the rain came down. December arrived in Millbrook County the way it always did, without apology, without transition, as if autumn had simply gotten tired and stopped showing up. The trees went bare overnight. The ground hardened. The light changed from golden to gray between 1 week and the next, and the cold settled into the old house in that particular way that old houses have of holding weather inside their walls. Emily had been there for almost 3 months. She'd stopped counting the days around week 6. She wasn't sure when it happened. She just noticed one morning that she didn't know exactly how many days it had been, and that the not knowing felt different from before. Before, not knowing had felt like losing track of something important. Now it just felt like being somewhere long enough to stop measuring it. That was its own kind of terrifying, actually, but it was a quieter terror than the ones she was used to. She was still at the community center 4 days a week. The program director, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who wore the same pair of reading glasses every day and had the organized chaos energy of someone running 3 things at once, had started asking Emily's opinion on the curriculum before making changes to it. Which was not nothing. It was, in fact, the first time anyone in a professional context had asked Emily Carter's opinion about anything in a long time. Victor had had opinions. Victor's opinions had a way of filling rooms. "We've got a new cohort starting in January," Rosa told her on a Thursday. 16 families. 8 of them have never had a checking account. 2 of them are dealing with wage theft from former employers and don't know they have recourse. She handed Emily a folder without ceremony. "I want you to lead the intake sessions." Emily looked at the folder. "I'm not certified in anything," she said. "You have a better completion rate than anyone on this staff," Rosa said. "People come back. They bring their cousins." She tapped the folder. "That's the certification I care about." Emily drove home that evening with the folder on the passenger seat and something unfamiliar sitting in her chest. It took her most of the drive to identify it. It was something close to purpose, not the borrowed kind, the kind she'd been carrying around on behalf of other people's plans. The real thing, which had its own weight and its own texture and sat differently than anything she'd felt in years. She told Mason about it at dinner. She hadn't intended to. It wasn't the kind of thing she'd made a habit of sharing, the small professional victories, but Sophie had asked what she was thinking about because Emily had been quiet, and then it just came out. "Rosa wants me to lead the intake sessions in January," Emily said. "What's an intake session?" Sophie asked, because Sophie asked that about everything. "It's when new people come to the program for the first time," Emily said. "I help them understand where they are financially and figure out what they want to work on." Sophie considered this with the gravity she brought to most information. "So you're like a map person." "A map person," Emily repeated. "Like when you don't know where you are, so someone shows you." Sophie speared a piece of broccoli. "That's important. I hate not knowing where I am." Mason was watching Emily across the table, not in the way that made her self-conscious exactly, more in the way that she'd started to notice meant he was actually paying attention to something. There was a difference between Mason looking at things and Mason seeing them. She'd figured that out around week 4. "That's a good thing," he said. "The intake sessions." "It's not a big deal," Emily said. "You said that about the financial literacy handout you rewrote, and Rosa laminated it and put it on every table in the center," Mason said. Emily looked at her plate. "She didn't need to do that." "She thought she did," Mason said simply. Sophie had already moved on to negotiating the terms of dessert with Mrs. Adler, who was clearing dishes with the selective hearing of someone who had decided the negotiation was beneath her notice. Emily watched the two of them for a moment. Sophie's theatrical appeals, Mrs. Adler's imperious silence, and felt that thing again, that quiet strangeness of being somewhere that had started to feel like somewhere. She didn't know what to do with it, so she started clearing dishes too. That was one of the things nobody told you about healing, she was learning. It didn't feel like getting better. It felt like getting confused in a different way than before. The sharp, constant pain went somewhere duller, which you'd think would be an improvement, but the dullness had this disorienting quality. You kept reaching for the pain and finding it wasn't quite where you'd left it, and that threw you off balance in ways that the pain itself never had. She was also starting to want things again. That was the part she really didn't know what to do with. She hadn't wanted things, real things, things for herself, in so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like. She'd had plans, goals, survival strategies. She'd wanted Victor to be someone other than who he was. She'd wanted Daniel to have been honest. She'd wanted her mother to be satisfied with less. But those weren't really wants. Those were negotiations. Those were the constant low-grade work of trying to make the world accommodate her existence, wanting something for herself, from herself, without reference to what anyone else needed it to be. That had dried up somewhere in her mid-20s, and she hadn't noticed its absence until it started seeping back in, slowly, the way circulation returns to a numb limb. With a pins and needles discomfort that was also, underneath it, a relief. She wanted to lead those intake sessions. She wanted to build something at the community center that would still be there after she was gone. She wanted Sophie to keep laughing at dinner, and she wanted Mason to keep having that look on his face when Emily said something honest, that slightly surprised look, like he was always mildly startled to find someone telling the truth. She shut that thought off at the source and went to help Mrs. Adler with the dishes. The older woman didn't say anything, but she handed Emily the dish towel without being asked, which was Mrs. Adler's version of a lot of things. It was during the third week of December that Emily's mother showed up at the gate. Mason saw the car from his office window, an older sedan, burgundy, the kind of car that had been well maintained for a very long time by someone who couldn't afford to replace it. It sat at the end of the driveway for almost 10 minutes before anyone got out. Emily was at the community center. Sophie was at school. Mason went down to the gate himself. Margaret Carter was 62 and looked both older and younger than that, the way women did when they'd spent their lives maintaining an appearance that the underlying exhaustion kept undermining. She was wearing a good coat, the kind of good coat that cost real money 20 years ago and had been kept because there wasn't money for another. She had Emily's eyes. Or Emily had hers, he supposed. The same dark green-brown with the same quality of watching everything. "You're the man my daughter is staying with," Margaret said. Not a question. "Mason Sterling," he said. "You want to come inside?" She looked past him at the house for a moment. Then she looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman who had been evaluating situations for survival her entire life. "I want to know what you want from her," she said. Mason had been expecting a version of this conversation. He'd had time to think about what he'd say. But standing here in the cold with Emily's mother looking at him like that, all the prepared answers fell away, and he was left with the simple one. "Nothing she doesn't want to give," he said. Margaret was quiet. "She makes bad choices with men," she said. It came out harsh, and she knew it. He saw her jaw tighten after she said it. "That's not an attack on her, it's just, she makes choices based on the options she has," Mason said. "Sometimes the options are bad. That's not the same thing." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Can I see her?" she said. And for the first time, the armor of it dropped away, and she just sounded like a woman who wanted to see her daughter. "She's at work," he said, "but you can wait." He made her tea in the kitchen, and she sat very straight in a chair and held the mug with both hands, and looked around the house in that particular way people looked at spaces that were very far from their own experience. Not with envy, exactly, more like translation, like she was converting it into a language she could understand. "She's okay?" Margaret asked. "She's actually okay?" "She's better than okay," Mason said. "She's good at things, your daughter. She helps people understand their money in a way that makes them feel capable. People bring their relatives. She has a, he thought about how to say it. She has a way of being in a room that makes the room feel less frightening. Not everyone can do that. Margaret looked down at her tea. She got that from her father, she said, very quietly. He could walk into any room, didn't matter who was in it, and people just... She stopped. He died when she was 11. He wasn't a good man in every way, but he could do that. Walk into a room. Mason nodded. She doesn't know I'm here, Margaret said. I figured. I thought... She stopped again, collected herself. When she ran from the wedding, I said things I can't take back. On the phone when she called, I said things about the embarrassment and the money we'd... She pressed her lips together. I was frightened, and I didn't say frightened. I said other things instead. She knows, Mason said. Margaret looked up. She knows the difference, he said, even when it's hard to hear. When Emily came home that afternoon, her mother was sitting in the library with a second cup of tea, looking at the photographs on the wall. Emily stood in the doorway for a full 5 seconds without moving. Mason watched from the hallway, not close enough to be part of it. Mom, Emily said. Hi, sweetheart, Margaret said. There was a silence, and then Emily walked in and sat down, not on the couch closest to her mother, but the armchair across from it. The careful distance of two people who loved each other and had recently said things that hadn't healed yet. Mason went back to his office. Whatever happened next in that room was not his. He found out later, from the careful neutrality of Emily's face at dinner and the single direct look she gave him that meant thank you without her saying it, that the conversation had gone the way those conversations sometimes went, imperfectly and honestly and without full resolution, which was maybe the best you could hope for with your mother. Margaret stayed for dinner. She sat across from Sophie and answered every question Sophie asked her with the patient forthrightness of a woman who had spent her whole life in the company of people who deserved straight answers. Sophie, who had a gift for identifying people worth talking to, decided immediately that Margaret was worth talking to and proceeded to monopolize her completely. Did Emily used to be annoying? Sophie asked. Sophie, Mason said. All children are annoying sometimes, Margaret said. Emily used to argue about everything. Dad says I argue about everything, Sophie said. Then you have something in common, Margaret said. Emily, sitting beside Mason, made a small sound into her water glass. It wasn't a perfect evening. There was a stiffness between Emily and her mother that 3 hours couldn't fix, and once, when Mason was in the kitchen getting more bread, he heard Margaret say something to Emily in a low voice that made Emily go very still. He didn't hear what it was. He came back with the bread and changed the subject, and the moment passed. But Margaret hugged Emily at the door when she left, and Emily let her, and that felt like something. Like the first small movement of something that had been stuck for a long time. After the door closed, Sophie, who had been observing the hug with the anthropological focus of a field researcher, announced, I like her grandmother energy. She's not your grandmother, Emily said, a bit faintly. I know, Sophie said. I said energy. She went upstairs. Emily stood in the front hall and put her hand briefly over her eyes. You okay? Mason asked. I don't know, she said honestly. Ask me tomorrow. He didn't push it. That was the thing about Mason. He had this quality of not pushing things that Emily had come to rely on in a way that frightened her a little. She was accustomed to men who pushed, who required processing, who needed things resolved, who had opinions about how and when you should feel what you felt. Mason just waited. He waited with the patience of someone who understood that things moved at the speed they moved, and pressing them didn't make them go faster, it just made them break. She didn't entirely trust it yet, but she was starting to. The week before Christmas, Sophie got sick. Nothing dramatic, a fever that spiked on a Monday night, a cough that kept her up until 2 a.m, the general disaster of a sick child who was old enough to be miserable about being sick, but not old enough to manage it quietly. Mason had been up with her until midnight when Emily appeared in the doorway of Sophie's room in the dark, still in the oversized sweatshirt she slept in, carrying a glass of cold water and a wet cloth she'd found somewhere. Go sleep, Emily said. I've got her. You don't have to... Mason started. I know, Emily said. Go. He hesitated, and then he went, because he was exhausted and because there was something in Emily's voice that wasn't an offer exactly. It was a statement of fact. He heard them through the wall for a while. Sophie's scratchy voice asking questions, Emily answering in the low, steady way she had, the murmur of some story Emily was apparently making up on the spot, because he caught fragments that involved a dragon who was afraid of the dark and a princess who was also a financial advisor. He fell asleep to the sound of it. In the morning, Sophie's fever was down. She was installed on the couch with a blanket and a very important sense of her own suffering. Emily had made soup from scratch, actual scratch, not from a can, and was in the process of negotiating the terms of the sick day with the focused energy of a diplomat. "You don't have to stay home," Mason told Emily. "Rosa needs you at the center." "Rosa has it covered," Emily said, stirring the soup without looking at him. "I called." "You called in to stay home with my sick kid. Is that a problem?" Mason looked at Sophie, who was watching this exchange with the bright-eyed attention of someone who was feeling better than she was letting on. "No," he said, "it's not a problem." He called into his own morning meeting and rescheduled it. He worked from the dining room table while Emily sat on the couch with Sophie, watching the particular terrible animated movies that Sophie required when ill. Around noon, he looked up and Sophie was asleep against Emily's shoulder, and Emily was reading something on her phone with the careful stillness of someone who didn't want to wake the person sleeping on them. She looked up and found him looking. He looked back down at his laptop, but his hands didn't move on the keyboard for a while after that. Christmas was strange and quiet and better than either of them had expected. Sophie had a list, which was seasonal and annual and always very specific, and which Mason had already addressed before Emily arrived, but which Sophie had updated since, apparently on the theory that new people in the house expanded the gift-giving possibilities. Emily had bought Sophie a book about a girl who traveled through time by solving math problems, which Sophie opened on Christmas morning and then didn't put down for 3 hours, which Emily seemed quietly thrilled about. Mason had gotten Emily something small, a leather notebook, the good kind, the kind that lasted because she'd been using a spiral-bound thing for notes on her program sessions, and he'd noticed her filling pages faster than she could replace it. He'd put it under the tree without ceremony, tucked beside Sophie's things. Emily held it in both hands when she opened it. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know that too," Mason said. Sophie looked between them with the expression of someone cataloging data. "Are you two being weird?" she asked. "We're being normal," Mason said. "You're being weird," Sophie confirmed and went back to her book. Emily laughed, and the awkwardness broke, and they drank terrible eggnog that Mrs. Adler made once a year because the recipe had belonged to her late husband, and she refused to abandon it regardless of how anyone felt about it. It wasn't perfect. There was a moment in the afternoon where Emily went quiet and stayed that way for almost an hour, sitting by the window while Sophie napped and Mason worked through some documents he'd been ignoring. He could feel the weight of whatever she was thinking, the particular gravity of someone carrying images from last year's version of this day, or the version that was supposed to happen 3 months ago, or the versions going all the way back to wherever her good Christmases had stopped. He didn't go to her. He almost did, twice, but he didn't. Some things needed to be sat through alone, and he'd learned the hard way that company offered at the wrong moment was just a different kind of intrusion. But later, after Sophie woke up and they made popcorn and watched something on TV that nobody was fully paying attention to, Emily shifted on the couch, and her shoulder was against his, and she didn't move away from it. He didn't move either. Sophie, who was sprawled across the other end of the couch with her feet almost in Emily's lap, and her book open on her chest, even though she wasn't reading it, made a small, satisfied sound that might have been about the popcorn and might have been about something else. It was January when Mason understood that he was in serious trouble. It happened without drama, as the important things in his life had a habit of doing. He was in a meeting with 3 of his partners, a quarterly review that should have had his full attention because they were discussing a resort development on the coast that he'd been pushing for 2 years. His phone was face down on the table. Someone was talking about site permits. He was thinking about what Emily had said at breakfast. Nothing significant. Something about a client at the center who'd finally gotten out of a payday loan cycle, and the way her face had looked when she said it, that particular animation that came into her when she talked about things that mattered to her. He'd been sitting at a conference table and thinking about Emily Carter's face. He caught himself and refocused and contributed intelligently to the next 15 minutes of discussion. But in the car on the way home, he let himself actually think about it. It wasn't simple. He wanted to be honest about that, at least to himself. Emily was a woman who had come to him in crisis, who was still building the architecture of a life, who had reasons to be careful about men and trust and the particular dangers of needing someone. He had a daughter who had already started to love her. He had a history that included a grief he'd mostly learned to live inside of, which was different from recovering from. And he was not, by any measure, an uncomplicated person to be around. He knew that. He had a way of getting absorbed in things, work, problems, Sophie. That meant he disappeared from himself sometimes, in ways that had frustrated people who tried to get close to him. Claire had called it going under. She'd figured out how to surface him. He wasn't sure anyone else ever had. He turned into the driveway and sat for a moment in the parked truck. Through the kitchen window he could see the light on. The shape of Emily moving, probably making something, because she'd started to take over more of the cooking in a way that nobody had discussed, and everybody had simply accepted as the new reality. He could hear very faintly music, something with a low guitar that Emily played sometimes in the evenings. He got out of the truck. He went inside. She was at the counter, chopping something, and she said, "How was the meeting?" without turning around. And he said, "Long." And she said, "There's wine open if you want it." And he poured himself a glass and leaned against the opposite counter and just talked to her for 40 minutes about the resort development and the permit problems and the partner who was being difficult. And she listened and asked questions that were smart and cut to the thing he was actually worried about, which was not the permits, but whether the development was the right thing to do to that particular stretch of coast. "What do you think?" she asked. "About the coast?" "I think it's beautiful," he said. "And I think it's going to be beautiful with or without the resort. And that's the thing I keep not saying in the meetings." Emily looked at him across the kitchen. "Then maybe that's the thing you should say," she said. He knew, standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday night in January, that it was already too late for uncomplicated. He'd known it, probably, since she took his hand in the rain. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. Not to her, not to himself, not to anyone. He wasn't ready to say it. He might not be ready for a long time, and she might not be either, and the space between what was true and what either of them was equipped to do about it was a particular kind of ache that he was going to have to carry carefully. He'd carried careful things before. He was good at it. Sophie came downstairs in her polar bear pajamas, looking for the book she'd left on the couch, and found both adults in the kitchen, and said, "Why do grown-ups always talk in the kitchen?" And neither of them had an answer for that. But the question made Emily laugh, that real laugh, the one that surprised her when it came. And Mason smiled into his wine glass. And outside, the January wind pushed against the old house, and the old house held. February came in cold and stayed that way. The resort development on the coast had been quietly shelved. Mason had said the thing he needed to say in the meeting, plainly and without apology. And his partners had looked at him with the particular expression of men who had not expected honesty and weren't sure what to do with it. They'd tabled the discussion. Mason had driven home feeling lighter than he had in months, which was either wisdom or recklessness, and he'd stopped being able to tell the difference. Emily's intake sessions had started in January and were already running over schedule, which Rosa told her was a good sign and a logistical problem simultaneously. The new cohort was 16 families, and they arrived every Tuesday and Thursday morning with the careful expressions of people who had spent a long time feeling ashamed of something that wasn't their fault. Emily had learned in the months of doing this work that the shame was always the first thing. Before the debt, before the confusion, before the practical problems. The shame sat on top of everything like a lid, and if you didn't lift it first, nothing else could breathe. She was good at lifting it. She didn't know exactly how, which made it hard to explain to Rosa when Rosa asked her to write up her methodology. She just talked to people like they were capable, because they were. And she didn't perform surprise when they understood things, because why would she? And she remembered their names and their specific situations from session to session without having to check her notes, which turned out to matter enormously to people who were used to being a file number. "You make them feel seen," Rosa said one afternoon. I just pay attention, Emily said. Most people don't, Rosa said simply, and went back to her paperwork. Emily drove home that Thursday, thinking about that, about whether paying attention was actually a skill or just the baseline of being a decent person, and why it felt like a skill, and what that said about how people were usually treated. She was still thinking about it when she pulled up to Mason's gate and found a car parked outside it. Not a car she recognized, a black Mercedes, current model, the kind of clean that meant it was either new or professionally detailed. It was running. She could see the exhaust. She almost pulled around it. The gate was coded and she could get through without the other car moving. But something made her slow down and then stop entirely, and then the driver's door of the Mercedes opened and Victor Langford got out. She had not seen him since October, since the night she'd walked away from a church vestibule in the rain. 4 months, and he looked exactly the same, which was somehow the most unsettling thing about him, that he just looked exactly the same. Dark suit, salt and pepper hair, still perfectly arranged, the particular posture of a man who had never once in his adult life had to make himself smaller to fit a space. Emily's hands were on the steering wheel, and she didn't move them. Victor walked toward her car. He stopped at her window and made a small gesture, a roll down the window gesture, patient, like he was flagging a taxi. She didn't roll it down. He tilted his head, said something she couldn't hear through the glass. His expression was the one she remembered. Not angry, not threatening, the expression that had taken her months to recognize as control, wearing the costume of reasonableness. He looked like a man who had come to have a reasonable conversation. He had always looked like that. She put the car in reverse. She drove back to the community center and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she could make her hands stop shaking enough to call Mason. He picked up on the second ring. "Victor's at your gate," she said. There was a brief silence. "Are you okay?" "I'm in my car. I saw him and I drove away." "Where are you?" "The center's parking lot." "Stay there," Mason said. His voice was flat and very calm in the way it got when he was managing something internally that he wasn't going to let out. "I'm going to the gate. Don't come back until I call you." "Mason, Emily, what are you going to say to him?" Another pause. "That you're not available." She heard him end the call, and she sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater going and her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Victor Langford. The fact of him, arriving at the gate, standing there with that expression. 4 months she'd been building something, slowly, imperfectly, but building. And he showed up in a black Mercedes, and her hand started shaking like it was day one. That made her angry. The shaking made her genuinely angry, in a way that was actually useful, the kind of anger that has a spine to it. She turned off the engine. Then she turned it back on, because she'd promised Mason she'd stay. At the gate, Mason had arrived to find Victor still there. The man had not moved. He was leaning against the front of his Mercedes with his arms loosely crossed, and he watched Mason come down the driveway with an expression of mild interest, like he was observing something he hadn't made up his mind about yet. Mason opened the gate and walked through it and stopped about 10 feet from Victor and said nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that in conversations where someone was used to controlling the frame, the most destabilizing thing you could do was decline to enter the frame at all. Victor looked him over, the kind of look that was doing an appraisal. "Mason Sterling," Victor said. He had one of those voices, resonant, modulated, a voice that had been trained over decades to project authority. "I've heard your name." "I know who you are," Mason said. Victor's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then this is efficient. You know why I'm here." "I have a guess," Mason said. "Emily isn't here." "She'll be back," Victor said. "She lives here, apparently." He glanced at the house visible at the end of the driveway. "That's interesting." "Not really," Mason said. Victor looked back at him. "I'd just like to speak with her. She and I have unfinished—" "She doesn't want to speak with you," Mason said. "With respect, that's her decision to make." "She made it," Mason said. "She made it in October." Something shifted in Victor's expression. Not much. The man was disciplined. But something. A tightening around the eyes. "She was upset in October," Victor said. "She acted impulsively. I understand that. I'm not here to cause problems. I'm genuinely just trying to... Victor. Mason used the name deliberately, without prefix, the way you'd use anyone's name. I'm going to be straightforward with you. Emily isn't here, she won't be coming to speak with you today, and this gate is private property. I'm asking you to leave. A beat. And if I'd like to wait? Victor said. Then you're trespassing, Mason said, and I'll make a call. Victor was quiet for a moment. The disciplined expression held, but Mason had spent 15 years reading rooms full of powerful men, and he knew what was underneath it. Not rage, not yet. Calculation. Victor Langford was the kind of man who didn't do anything impulsively. He was assessing the situation, adjusting, figuring out the new angles. You seem very invested, Victor said, for a man who found her on the side of a road. Mason didn't react to that. I'll tell her you came by, Mason said. Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and straightened up and gave a small nod. The nod of a man who was choosing to retreat because it suited him, not because he had to. Tell her I'd like to talk, Victor said. Tell her there are things about her situation she doesn't fully understand. I'll tell her you said that, Mason said. Victor got back in his car and drove away, and Mason stood at the gate and watched until the car was gone. Then he took out his phone. Emily picked up immediately. He's gone, Mason said. She exhaled, long, ragged. What did he say? That he wants to talk. That there are things about your situation you don't fully understand. He paused. Do you know what he means by that? A silence. Maybe, Emily said. Before I ran, there were some documents I signed, related to the wedding, some financial stuff. I didn't read them properly. He had a lawyer present, everything, and it was all moving so fast, and She stopped. I signed things. Mason stood at the gate in the February cold. Okay, he said. Come home. We'll figure it out. She came back. She was composed in the way she got when she'd made a decision to be composed, which was a different thing from actually being calm, and they sat in Mason's office, the room she'd never been in before, the serious room, and he poured 2 glasses of water and put them on the desk and sat across from her. Tell me what you signed, he said. I don't remember exactly, she said. There was a cohabitation agreement before the wedding. Victor said it was standard, and something about shared financial responsibility during the engagement period. She rubbed her forehead. There was a loan, actually. My mother's house. Victor arranged a refinancing. He said it was a better rate, and my mother signed something and I co-signed because Victor said it was a formality and... Emily. She stopped. Your mother's house is tied to a loan Victor arranged, Mason said. Emily looked at him. Yes, she said. I think so. The room was quiet. That's the thing he wants to talk about, Emily said. She'd arrived at it herself. He could see, in real time, the pieces assembling. That's what things about your situation you don't fully understand means. He can call the loan. If I don't... She stopped. My mother. He'd go after my mother's house. The anger that moved through Mason at that moment was cold and very specific, which was the most dangerous kind. Does your mother know? He asked. I don't think she understands what she signed, Emily said. She's not... Documents confuse her. She trusted me and I trusted Victor, and I didn't read it properly, and Her voice cracked, just once, and she pressed it flat. I let him into everything. I let him into every part of our lives. Stop, Mason said. She looked at him. Stop blaming yourself for being deceived by someone whose entire strategy was to deceive you, he said. We'll deal with this. Mason, you don't... I have lawyers, he said. Good ones. I'd like to have one of them look at whatever Victor arranged before we do anything else. Can you get copies of the documents? My mother might have them. Call her tonight, Mason said. And then let me make a call. Emily looked at him across the desk. She looked tired in the way she hadn't looked in months, that particular October tiredness that had started to lift. He hated seeing it back on her face. Why are you doing this? She said. And she meant it differently than she'd meant it before, all those months ago in the kitchen. Before she'd asked it with suspicion. Now she asked it with something more complicated, something that knew the answer might matter more than she was ready for it to. Because he had no right to build a trap around you, Mason said, and because I'm not going to sit in this house and let him use it. Emily held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said quietly. She called her mother. The conversation was short and appeared to cause both women pain in different ways, because these conversations always did. Margaret Carter, it turned out, had a folder of documents in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. Everything Victor's lawyer had presented to her, everything she'd signed with Emily's reassurances ringing in her ears. And she read out the cover sheet while Emily listened with her hand pressed flat against the kitchen table like she was bracing for something. When she hung up, Emily sat for a moment. Then she said, "He owns the terms of the loan. He set it up through a company he controls. If there's a default on any payment or a triggering clause, he can call it immediately." She looked at Mason. "There's a triggering clause, an abandonment clause, which apparently you triggered when you left the wedding," Mason said. "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Adler had gone home. Sophie was upstairs doing homework or pretending to. Outside the window, the February dark had come down fully, and the old trees at the edge of the property were moving in a wind that hadn't been there an hour ago. "He built it before the wedding," Emily said. She said it slowly, like she was assembling the architecture of it for the first time. "He built the whole thing before the wedding. The loan, the documents, the refinancing. He set it up so that if I ever left—" She stopped. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't, and she put them in her lap where he couldn't see them. "I was never going to be able to leave. That was the plan." Mason didn't say anything immediately. He let her finish arriving at it, because she needed to arrive at it herself. "He didn't love me," she said. And the way she said it wasn't devastated exactly. It was something more exhausted than devastated. "I don't think he was even... I think I was a project. I think he decided he wanted a certain kind of life, and I fit the specifications, and he just..." She shook her head. "I was so desperate to believe someone saw me." "Someone does," Mason said. She looked at him. He hadn't intended to say it. It came out of the place where the careful things had been living for weeks, and once it was out, he couldn't take it back. And he didn't particularly want to, but the timing was terrible, and he knew it. "Mason," she started. "I know," he said. "Not the right moment. Forget I said it." "I can't forget you said it." "I know that too." He stood up. "I'm going to call my lawyer tonight. Whatever Victor built, we're going to find the architecture of it, and we're going to find the way out of it. That's what we're doing right now." Emily was still looking at him. He could feel it even with his back turned, moving to the phone on his desk. "Okay," she said, after a moment. "Okay." Mason's lawyer was a woman named Patricia Hyun, who had the quality of making large problems sound like problems that had solutions, which was the most valuable thing about her. He reached her on her cell at 8:15 and explained the situation in the compressed, specific way she preferred, and she listened without interrupting and then said, "Send me the documents tomorrow morning. I need to see the loan structure and the cohabitation agreement before I can tell you what we're looking at, but what you're describing, the triggering clause, the abandonment language, that's aggressive. That's the kind of instrument you don't draft by accident." "I know," Mason said. "This Langford, you said he's in commercial real estate?" "Primarily." "Do you know if he's done this before? With other women? Other arrangements?" The question hung there. "I don't know," Mason said, "but it's worth finding out." After he hung up, he came back to the kitchen. Emily was still at the table. She'd made tea at some point, and there was a second mug sitting across from her seat. He sat down. "Patricia Hyun is going to look at the documents," he said. "Is she good?" "She found a $7 million liability clause in a partnership agreement that 3 other lawyers had missed," Mason said. "She's good." Emily wrapped her hands around her mug. "Is she expensive?" Emily: "I'm serious. I want to pay—" "You're not paying for the lawyer," Mason said. "Stop." She opened her mouth. "Stop," he said again, not unkindly. "You can argue about it when this is over. Right now, we're focused." She closed her mouth. Then, "I hate this." "I know. I hate that he gets to show up and I spend 20 minutes shaking in a parking lot because I spent months starting to feel like myself again. And he drives up in his stupid car and... She stopped, pushed the mug away slightly and pulled it back. I hate that he still has that. He doesn't, Mason said. My hands shook. Your hands shook, Mason said. You drove away, you called me, you came back, you sat here and thought through the whole structure of what he did without falling apart. Your hands shook for 20 minutes in a parking lot. That's not him having power over you. That's just your nervous system. And your nervous system has had a difficult year. Emily stared at him. That's either very wise or I'm too tired to tell the difference, she said. Possibly both, Mason said. She almost laughed. Not quite, but the thing around her eyes loosened slightly, and she picked up the mug and drank the tea. Victor's second visit came 4 days later. This time he didn't come to the gate. He came to the community center. Rosa called Emily, who was in the back office going over January's program data, and said, "There's a man in the lobby asking for you. He says his name is Victor Langford and that you're expecting him." "I'm not expecting him," Emily said. "I didn't think so," Rosa said. "Tell him I'm not available." "Happily," Rosa said, with the cheerful directness of a woman who had been managing difficult people since before Emily was born. But Victor didn't leave. He sat in the lobby waiting area for 2 hours, in his dark suit, among the families waiting for their intake appointments. Rosa reported this to Emily with the running updates of a field correspondent. "He's still there. He accepted a cup of water. He's making the Okonkwo family uncomfortable. He's reading a magazine he brought himself, which I find very presumptuous." Emily stayed in the back, but she thought about it the whole time, about what it meant that he'd come here. He'd found out where she worked, which meant he'd been watching or paying someone to watch, which meant this had been going on longer than his appearance at the gate 4 days ago. He'd been building a map of her life while she was living it. That was not a man coming to have a reasonable conversation. That was a man executing a plan. When Victor finally left, after Rosa, at hour 2, went out to the lobby and informed him pleasantly that the building was closing for a private event and he was welcome to leave or she'd need to call someone, and Victor, who was disciplined about scenes, left. Emily sat in Rosa's office and told her everything. Rosa listened with her reading glasses pushed up on her head and her hands folded on the desk, and when Emily was done, Rosa said, "Do you have a lawyer?" "Mason's lawyer is looking at the documents." "Mason Sterling," Rosa said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." Rosa was quiet for a moment, looking at Emily with an expression Emily couldn't entirely read. "Victor Langford's company donated to a development project near here 3 years ago," Rosa said. "I know his name because we considered his company for a grant partnership and decided against it." "Why?" "Because when I looked into it, I found 2 women who'd had professional arrangements with him that ended badly," Rosa said. "Very carefully. Nothing you could point to and say, 'There, that's the thing,' just a pattern of women who were in positions of dependency and then weren't in them anymore." She looked at Emily. "You're not the first person he's done this to." The words landed in the room and stayed there. "Patricia Hyun is looking into whether there's a pattern," Emily said. She heard her own voice, distant, like someone talking in another room. "Good," Rosa said. "Let her look." That night, Emily was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was processing something too large to talk about yet. Sophie, who had a radar for this that put most adults to shame, sat next to Emily on the couch after dinner without being asked, and leaned against her arm and said nothing, just watched TV with her shoulder pressed against Emily's and let that be sufficient. It was, Emily thought, the most purely kind thing anyone had done for her in a while. The uncomplicated offering of presents from a 9-year-old in polar bear pajamas. "Hey, Soph," Emily said after a while. "Do you know what you want to be when you grow up?" Sophie considered it with the gravity the question deserved. "A marine biologist or a detective," she said. "Maybe both." "Those go together, actually," Emily said. "I know," Sophie said. "Ocean crime. There's a lot of it." Emily pressed her lips together. "There really is," she said. Mason came in from his office and stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at the 2 of them on the couch. And the expression that crossed his face was one he didn't entirely manage to keep contained before Emily looked over and caught it. He came and sat on the other side of Sophie. Ocean crime, Sophie informed him. That's my career plan. That's a good plan, Mason said. He didn't look at Emily. He didn't need to. The three of them sat there in the lamplight watching some nature documentary Sophie had found, and the house held the weather outside, and it was enough. Patricia Hyun called Mason the following Wednesday. He was in his office when she called, and he listened for 11 minutes, and when he came to find Emily, she was in the library, which had become her room in the way that rooms in old houses do. Slowly, through the accumulation of her things on the side table, her books on the shelf, her handwriting on a notepad left on the arm of the chair. Patricia found something, he said. Emily put down her pen. Victor has done this before, Mason said. Twice. 2 other women, different structures, same principle, Tom. Financial instruments built around personal relationships, triggered by separation. One settled quietly. The other didn't have the resources to fight it and lost. He sat down across from her. Patricia also found inconsistencies in how the loan was structured. She believes the abandonment clause may not be enforceable. It's written to look like a standard term, but it applies conditions that a court is unlikely to uphold. Emily was very still. What does that mean? She said. It means he built a cage, Mason said, but he built part of it out of materials that can't hold. He paused. It's not a guarantee. Patricia is being careful about what she promises, but she says we have a real argument. In my mother's house? Emily said. That's the stronger argument, Mason said. Your mother signed a document that her own attorney never reviewed. Victor's lawyer presented it without independent counsel. Patricia says there's a strong case that the document wasn't executed under proper conditions. Emily exhaled slowly. This is going to go to court? She said. Maybe, Mason said. Or Patricia makes it clear to Victor's lawyers that we have enough to make a serious challenge, and he calculates whether a protracted legal fight is worth what it costs him publicly. He looked at her carefully. Victor Langford is a man who depends on reputation. A pattern of women, documented, on the public record. That's a different calculation than one woman with no resources who goes away quietly. You're saying he might back down, Emily said. I'm saying Patricia is very good at making men understand their options, Mason said. The silence between them had a particular texture to it. Not uncomfortable exactly. Dense, maybe, like there was a lot inside it. I need to tell you something, Emily said. Mason waited. When you said, last week in the office, what you said, she stopped, reorganized. I've been trying to figure out why it scared me. And, Mason said carefully, I think it's because it's true, she said. The things I feel when I'm here, the things I feel when I'm around you and Sophie, they're real, and they're mine, and I haven't had something that was genuinely mine in so long that I don't entirely know what to do with it. She looked at her hands. I'm not whole yet. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still a project under construction, and I'm worried about... Emily, Mason said. She looked up. I know, he said. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I told you to forget I said it. I told you I couldn't, she said. I know that too. They looked at each other across the library in the gray February light, 2 people who were not unaware of the distance between what was true and what was possible, sitting with it in the only way available to them, which was imperfectly. Victor is going to come back, Emily said finally. He's not done. Probably not, Mason said. And when he does, Mason said, we'll be ready. He said we without thinking about it, without ceremony. The way you said we when it had already become true and you'd both just been waiting to say it out loud. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. Outside, the February wind moved through the old trees and the house held them the way old houses hold the people inside them, imperfectly, with drafts and settling, and the particular creaks of a structure that has weathered many seasons. Not perfectly, but reliably. Victor's third move came 10 days later, and it was the one none of them had seen coming. It didn't come through the gate. It didn't come through the community center. It came through Emily's phone, a number she didn't recognize, and a voice she recognized immediately. Daniel Hartley. She was in the parking lot of a grocery store when she answered, and she sat in her car with the engine off and her grocery bags in the back seat and listened to the voice from 6 years ago say her name. Emily, I know you don't want to hear from me. I'm calling because Victor Langford called me first. She didn't say anything. He found me, Daniel said. I don't know how. He has some things. Things about the time we spent together. Things he said he'd make public, about both of us. He said if I didn't, he wanted me to talk to you, to tell you that you should deal with him directly. That fighting him would cost you more than settling. Emily stared through the windshield. He's using you to get to me, she said. Yes, Daniel said simply. Why are you calling to warn me instead of just... Why didn't you just not call? A silence. Because I owe you that much, Daniel said. I owe you more than that, actually, but I can start there. She sat in that parking lot for a long time after she hung up. What Victor had just done was not the move of a man who was worried about legal outcomes. It was the move of a man who wanted her to feel surrounded, isolated, who wanted her to understand that there was no part of her life he couldn't reach into. 6 years ago, Daniel Hartley, a man who'd lied to her and broken something in her that had taken years to start to mend. And Victor had found him, had pulled him out of the past and aimed him at her like a reminder of everything she'd ever been naive about. Her hands started shaking. She noticed them. She put them flat on the steering wheel and she breathed. 3 times, 4 times, slow. She looked at the grocery store in front of her with its ordinary fluorescent sign and its ordinary people pushing ordinary carts, and she thought about Sophie asking for the cheese to go in while the eggs were still in the pan. She thought about Mason standing at his kitchen counter telling her she was allowed to want things. She thought about Rosa's reading glasses and her mother's good coat and Mrs. Adler handing her the dish towel without being asked. She thought about the woman who had sat in the rain in a destroyed wedding dress and taken a stranger's hand. That woman had nothing, and she had survived. She picked up her phone. She called Mason. Victor reached out to Daniel Hartley, she said when he answered. A pause. Daniel, the man from before Victor? Yes, she said. Daniel called to warn me. Victor's threatening to make their past public if Daniel doesn't pressure me to settle. Mason was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had that particular quality. Flat, controlled, the organized interior making itself felt. He's escalating, Mason said. Yes. Are you okay? She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. They were steadier now. Yes, she said. I'm angry, actually. I'm really angry. Good, Mason said, and she could hear something in his voice that she'd heard once or twice before, that underneath quality she'd identified early on. Whatever it was, it had a shape to it now, a direction. Come home. I need to make a call. She gathered her grocery bags and drove back through the cold February afternoon, and the anger stayed with her the whole way. Not the shaking kind, not the helpless kind, but the kind that has clarity in it, the kind that knows exactly what it is and why and what needs to happen next. Whatever Victor Langford thought he had built around her, he had made the mistake of building it while she was still becoming someone he hadn't accounted for. He had planned for the woman she was when they met, frightened, exhausted, desperate to be chosen. He had no plan for the woman sitting in that car, and he had no plan at all for Mason Sterling. The call Mason made that night lasted 47 minutes. Emily knew this because she was in the kitchen making dinner, something that required enough attention to keep her hands busy, but not enough to stop her from hearing the low, measured sound of Mason's voice coming through the closed office door. Not the words, just the voice. That particular register he used when he was handling something, when the organized interior had assessed a situation and decided on a direction. She didn't ask about it when he came out. She put a plate in front of him and waited. He sat down, looked at the food, then looked at her. Patricia has been gathering information on Victor's financial structure for the past 2 weeks, he said. I asked her to expand the scope when he showed up at the gate. Tonight I gave her the full picture. Daniel, the community center visit, what Victor said to Daniel about the public record. And, Emily said. And Patricia contacted a journalist she trusts at the Millbrook Gazette 2 hours ago, Mason said. Not to publish anything, to make Victor aware that someone is asking questions. Emily set down her fork. That's pressure, Mason said. Victor is calculating. He needs to believe that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of stopping. Is that ethical? Emily said. Mason looked at her. The journalist is genuinely interested in the story. Patricia didn't invent anything. She gave a journalist factual information about a pattern of behavior that affects multiple women. If Victor wants to call that pressure, he can. Emily thought about it. What's the call you made tonight? She said. The 47-minute one. A beat. How do you know how long it was? I was listening to your voice through the door, she said simply. Not the words, just, you were in there a long time. Something moved across his face. I called a man named Gerald Marsh, Mason said. He's a commercial real estate developer. He and Victor have been in a joint venture for the last 18 months, a mixed-use project in the city. I know Gerald. We were at school together. Very briefly, we've stayed in contact. And you called him to do what? Emily said carefully. To have a conversation, Mason said. About the joint venture. About whether Gerald had done thorough due diligence on his partner. He paused. I didn't make any threats. I didn't make any accusations. I told Gerald what I knew, which is a matter of documented record, and I told him that Patricia Hyun was preparing a legal challenge that would likely become public. Gerald is a careful man. He asked questions. I answered them. Emily was quiet. Victor needs that joint venture, Mason said. It's his biggest active project. If Gerald starts asking questions, or worse, starts considering his options, that's a different kind of problem than a legal challenge. That's his professional world looking at him. You went after his money, Emily said. I went after his calculation, Mason said. Victor does everything by calculation. I want his calculation to change. It wasn't clean. Emily knew that. It was the kind of move that operated in the gray territory between legitimate and something more aggressive, and she sat with the discomfort of it for a moment because she thought she owed herself that honesty. But then she thought about Daniel Hartley's voice on the phone, and Victor sitting in the community center lobby for 2 hours, and the trigger clause he'd built into a loan on her mother's house before the wedding because he'd already planned for her eventual attempt to leave. Okay, she said. Okay, Mason said. I'm not going to pretend I'm above it, she said. I'm not. Mason nodded. Then he picked up his fork and ate, and Emily did too, and the kitchen was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of an evening winding down. Sophie's footsteps upstairs, the radiator ticking, the wind that had been running against the house all week. Mason, Emily said. Yeah. Thank you. She said it plainly, without the apologetic quality she sometimes loaded onto gratitude. Just the thing itself. He looked at her across the table. Don't thank me yet, he said. Victor hasn't done anything yet. He was right about that. 3 days after Mason's call to Gerald Marsh, Victor Langford arrived at Mason's office. Not the house. The office, a floor in a building in the city, 40 minutes from Millbrook, which meant Victor had not simply driven past on his way somewhere. He had made an appointment under a different name with Mason's assistant, gotten through the lobby, and appeared in the outer office on a Thursday afternoon requesting to speak with Mason Sterling directly. Mason's assistant, a composed young man named Derek, who had worked for Mason for 4 years and had the quality of being unimpressed by most things, sent Mason a single message. A man named Victor Langford is here. Says it's personal. Shall I call security? Mason sent back, give me 5 minutes and then send him in. Stay in the building. He had 5 minutes. He used them to call Patricia and tell her where he was and who was coming through the door. And Patricia said, don't agree to anything and don't let him leave thinking he's won something, in the tone of a woman who had prepped enough people for enough difficult conversations to know that those were the 2 essential rules. Then Derek sent Victor in. Victor Langford walked into Mason Sterling's office and looked at it with the expression of a man doing real estate assessment, which he probably was. The office was not extravagant. Mason had never gone in for extravagant workspaces. He found them distracting, but it was substantial, and the city view through the windows was the kind of view that communicated something about position without having to say it directly. Victor sat down across from Mason's desk without being invited to. I appreciate you seeing me, Victor said. I didn't, technically, Mason said. You made an appointment under a false name. Victor's mouth moved. Philip Norton is my middle name and my mother's maiden name. It's not false. It's creative, Mason said. There was a moment of two men looking at each other. Mason had met men like Victor before, not many, but enough. Men who were intelligent and disciplined and had organized their entire lives around the premise that other people were resources to be managed. They had a particular quality in person, something almost impersonal, like they were present but also calculating a remove from everything happening in real time. You've been making calls, Victor said. I make a lot of calls, Mason said. It's a large part of my work. Gerald Marsh, Victor said. Gerald and I go back a long time, Mason said. You told him things about me. I told him true things about you, Mason said. There's a distinction. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. The first real tell. You've inserted yourself into a private matter. Emily Carter isn't a private matter, Mason said. She's a person. She's someone who made commitments and walked away from them, Victor said. And I'm trying to find a reasonable resolution that doesn't require... Victor, Mason kept his voice completely level. I've read the loan documents. I've had a very good lawyer read them. The abandonment clause you built into Margaret Carter's refinancing is the most calculated act of financial coercion I've read in years, and I've been in business for 15 years. He leaned forward slightly. You built a trap. You built it before the wedding. You built it because you knew she might eventually figure out who you actually were, and you wanted to make sure she had nowhere to go. The room was very quiet. Victor said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Patricia Hyun is filing a challenge to the loan instrument next week, Mason said. We have grounds. The independent counsel issue alone is enough to open the door, and once it's open, the abandonment clause looks like what it is. He paused. Additionally, a journalist at the Millbrook Gazette has been looking into your professional history. There are two other women who had similar experiences. That story gets more interesting with a third. You're threatening me, Victor said. I'm explaining your situation, Mason said. There's a distinction there, too. Victor was silent for a moment. The disciplined expression held, but something underneath it had shifted. Mason could feel it the way you felt, a change in pressure, not see it directly. What do you want? Victor said. I want the loan released, Mason said. All of it. The principal, the triggering clause, everything. I want Margaret Carter's house clear and clean with documentation within 30 days. I want the cohabitation agreement voided in writing, and I want you to stop. He said the last part simply, without embellishment. The visits, the surveillance, the contact with people from Emily's past, all of it. And in exchange, Victor said, Patricia doesn't file, Mason said. The journalist doesn't have the third story that makes the pattern undeniable. And Gerald Marsh continues to have an undisturbed partnership with you. He folded his hands on the desk. That's the exchange. Victor was very still. You've put this together quickly, he said. Emily has been at my house since October, Mason said. You waited until February to come to my gate. I had time. Something crossed Victor's face. Not anger exactly, something more complicated than anger. The particular expression of a man who has realized he badly miscalculated the weight of what he was up against. She means something to you, Victor said. It came out almost like he was still processing it, like it hadn't been part of his model. Yes, Mason said simply. Victor looked at him for a long moment. She's difficult, Victor said. She's stubborn, and she second-guesses everything, and she was never... He stopped. And for just a second, under the discipline and the calculation, Mason saw something that might have been a genuine emotion. Not love, he didn't think, but something. Some real thing that had gotten buried under the architecture of control so long ago that Victor probably couldn't find it himself anymore. She was never going to be happy with me. No, Mason agreed. She wasn't. Victor stood up. He stood up and straightened his jacket and looked at the city through Mason's windows for a moment, and then he looked at Mason with an expression that was the closest thing to honest Mason had seen on his face. Tell Patricia Hyun to send the release documents to my lawyer, Victor said. I'll have them signed within the week. He left. Mason sat at his desk for a few minutes after the door closed. He wasn't triumphant exactly. That wasn't the feeling. It was more like the particular exhaustion that comes after something has been sustained and then releases, a tension dropping out of the muscles all at once. He called Patricia. "He's going to sign," Mason said. "I want it in writing before I believe it," Patricia said. "So do I," Mason said. He called Emily. She answered on the first ring. She'd been waiting. He could hear it in the single syllable of her answer. "He's releasing the loan," Mason said. Patricia is going to get it in writing, but he agreed." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that he almost said her name. Then she said, "My mother's house." "Is going to be fine," Mason said. Another silence. "He came to your office," Emily said. "Yes." "Are you okay?" The question caught him slightly off guard. Not because it was surprising. He knew who Emily was. He knew she'd ask. But because of the order of it. Her mother's house first. Him second. The consideration of it. "I'm fine," he said. It was a conversation. He's not going to fight this. "Why not?" Emily said. "He had resources. He could have, because fighting it meant the story becoming public," Mason said. "And Victor Langford needs his reputation more than he needs to win." He paused. "Also, I think he was more tired of it than he let on." "Tired of what?" "Of carrying the weight of everything he built," Mason said. "Traps are heavy. You have to maintain them." Emily was quiet. "I'm coming home," she said. "Sophie's making a case for pizza tonight," Mason said. "Just so you're prepared." She laughed. Actually laughed. The real one. And the sound of it over the phone in his city office in the middle of a Thursday afternoon was something he was going to keep. "I'll stop on the way," she said. The pizza was from a place Sophie had recently decided was the only acceptable pizza in Millbrook County, which was a strong position for a 9-year-old, but one she maintained with conviction. Emily came through the door with 2 boxes, and Sophie met her in the hallway and took one of the boxes without preamble and carried it to the kitchen with the gravity of someone who had been entrusted with something important. They ate at the kitchen table, and Sophie explained, at length, a conflict that had developed at school between 2 of her friends that had something to do with a misunderstanding about a borrowed eraser that had apparently escalated into a larger thing about trust and fairness. Emily and Mason both listened seriously and offered opinions when asked, and Sophie considered the opinions and dismissed some of them and incorporated others, and by the time the pizza was gone, she had arrived at a plan of action that seemed reasonable to all parties. "Okay," Sophie said. "I'll talk to both of them tomorrow." "That's the move," Emily said. "I know," Sophie said. She picked up her plate. "Is the bad man going to go away now?" The table went quiet. Emily and Mason looked at each other across Sophie's head. "What bad man?" Mason said carefully. "The one Emily was scared of," Sophie said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone who had observed and catalogued but been waiting for the right moment to deploy the information. "I could tell she was scared. She gets a certain face." "I have a certain face," Emily said. "You do," Sophie said. "It's the same one you had the night Dad found you, when you first got here." She looked at Emily with 9-year-old directness. "You haven't had it in a while, but you had it again for a few weeks." Emily pressed her lips together. "He's going away," Emily said. "Yes." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Good." She took her plate to the sink. "Can I watch something before bed?" 30 minutes, Mason said. Sophie accepted this and disappeared into the living room. They heard the TV come on, something with too much music in the score. Emily and Mason were left at the kitchen table with the pizza boxes and the quiet. "She noticed," Emily said. "She notices everything," Mason said. "She just picks her moments." "She said I had a certain face when I first got here," Emily said. She turned her water glass slowly on the table. "I think that's probably true." "You had a pretty rough night," Mason said. "Yeah." She looked up at him. "I don't have it now. The face." "I know," Mason said. Does that mean something? I mean, what is that?" She stopped herself. "I keep starting sentences I don't know how to finish." "That seems accurate," Mason said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. They sat there. "I want to tell you something," Emily said, "and I don't want you to say anything until I'm done." "Okay," Mason said. "When Daniel called me," she said, My first instinct, before the anger, before anything else, was to call you. Not Rosa, not my mother, not anyone from my old life. She looked at the table. I called you first, and then the anger came, and I want you to know that's not nothing for me. Knowing where to go when something bad happens, knowing there's a somewhere to go. I haven't had that in a very long time. Mason waited. She glanced up. You can talk now. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment, organizing. When Claire died, I spent about a year being very good at managing things. Sophie, the business, the house. Everything had a system. Everything could be handled. He turned his own glass. And then one night Sophie had a bad dream, and I went to her room, and she asked me if I missed Mommy, and I said yes, and she said she did too, and I sat on the floor of her room for 3 hours because I genuinely couldn't move. Emily was very still. The managing is real, he said. I'm actually good at it, but it was partly a wall. Useful things can be walls. He looked at her. You know what I mean. I do, she said quietly. The difference between now and 4 years ago, he said, is that now when something breaks through the managing, when something actually gets to me, I can feel the difference. I know what it is. He paused. You get to me, Emily. You have for a long time. I'm not going to keep organizing around that. The kitchen was very quiet. Emily looked at him for a long moment. That direct, unguarded look she parceled out carefully. I'm still a project under construction, she said. It wasn't the same warning it had been the last time she'd said it. It had less fear in it. So is everyone, Mason said. Genuinely. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. You seem pretty put together, she said. I spent 3 hours on a child's bedroom floor, he said. I told you. She almost smiled. Then she did smile. The real one. The one that changed her whole face. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. It wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't a resolution. It was more like the acknowledgement of a direction. Two people agreeing on a compass point and then not saying anything else about it. Because some things move better when you don't keep talking about them, when you let them do what they're going to do without excessive commentary. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. My 30 minutes is up, she announced. I'm going to bed, but I want both of you to come say goodnight. Since when is that a both situation, Mason said. Since now, Sophie said, and went back upstairs. Mason looked at Emily. Emily looked at Mason. She said, since now, Emily said. They went upstairs. Victor Langford's lawyers sent the release documents to Patricia Hyun 11 days later, 4 days ahead of the promised 30. Patricia reviewed them with her characteristic thoroughness and then called Mason to report that they were, as far as she could tell, complete and legitimate. He did everything, she said. Loan release, abandonment clause voided, the cohabitation agreement nullified. It's clean. Good, Mason said. He moved faster than I expected, Patricia said. Gerald Marsh must have rattled him. Or he was ready to be done with it, Mason said. Do you believe that? Patricia said. Mason thought about Victor standing at the window in his office, the particular expression on his face when he'd said she was never going to be happy with me. The calculation in it, and underneath the calculation, the small, genuine thing that had nowhere to go. Partly, Mason said. Emily took the documents to her mother's house on a Saturday morning in early March. Mason drove her but stayed in the car, because that wasn't his moment to be in. He watched her walk up the path to Margaret Carter's front door, a small house in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, but was held together by the determination of people who took care of what they had. He watched Margaret open the door, watched the two women stand in the doorway for a moment, and then go inside. He sat in the car for an hour and a half. He answered emails. He called Derek about a Monday meeting. He watched a neighbor across the street rake something out of a garden bed with the concentrated focus of a person who found gardening meditative. When Emily came out, she'd been crying. Not recently. The same as before, the washed-off traces around the eyes. She got in the car and put on her seatbelt and sat looking forward for a moment. She cried, Emily said. My mother doesn't cry. She cried. Mason didn't say anything. She said she was sorry, Emily said. My mother. For the things she said on the phone, for the pressure about Victor, for all of it. She exhaled. She said she was so afraid of what would happen to me that she tried to arrange my life, and she knows she went too far. What did you say? Mason asked. I said I know, Emily said, and I said I wasn't going anywhere. She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were red-edged. I said I'd found something and I wasn't going anywhere. Mason nodded. He started the car. She asked about you, Emily said. Yeah? She asked what kind of man you were. Emily looked out the window as the neighborhood moved past. I said you were the kind who stops. Who stops? Mason repeated. When something moves in the rain, Emily said. You stop. Not everyone does. He drove. The early March light was doing the thing it did this time of year. Still thin, but with the suggestion of warmth in it, the suggestion of what was coming. The trees along the road were still bare, but the buds were forming, the small, tight futures of them visible if you looked. I want to do something, Emily said. At the community center. Something bigger than what I'm doing. Tell me, Mason said. Rosa's been talking about expanding the program. Not just financial literacy, but actual seed grants. Small amounts for families who have a plan but no capital, like genuinely small, $500 to $2,000, enough to start something. She sat forward slightly, the energy that came into her when she was talking about things that mattered. A lot of the families I work with have ideas, real ones. They've been thinking about them for years, and the only thing between them and doing something is $1,000 and someone who takes them seriously. She paused. I want to build that. I want to build the grant program. Do you need money? Mason said. I need money, Emily said, and I need help structuring it. Legally, administratively, the whole thing. How much? Mason said. She looked at him. You can't just... How much to start? He said. She was quiet for a moment. He could tell she was fighting the reflex. The one that said, don't need too much, don't ask for too much, make yourself small enough to be acceptable. 50,000 to launch, she said, a real launch, with infrastructure. Okay, Mason said. Mason, it's a good program, he said. I've watched you work for 5 months. You know what you're doing. And 50,000 in seed grant capital is not a large ask for something with real structure behind it. He glanced at her. I'd also like to connect you with 2 or 3 people I know who do this kind of philanthropic work. Not to take over, just to help you build it right from the beginning. Emily looked at him for a long moment. You didn't even hesitate, she said. No, he said. Why not? Because I've been watching you since October, he said. I know what you do with things you care about. The car moved through the early March landscape, bare trees and thin light, and the suggestion of something green underneath the surface of everything, waiting for enough warmth to come forward. Emily turned to look out her window. When she spoke, her voice was different than it had been. Not smaller, actually larger, but in a quieter way. The way things are large when they're real. I keep thinking about who I was in October, she said. In that rain, I had nothing. I was nothing, I felt like. I had run so far from the wrong life that I ended up on a road in a storm with no shoes. 1 shoe, Mason said. She almost smiled. 1 shoe. And I keep thinking, every single thing that happened since then, my mother and me talking, Rosa and the program, Sophie and the eggs. She paused. You, all of it. It came from that one night. It came from you being brave enough to run, Mason said. I wasn't brave, Emily said. I was just out of options. That's what brave usually is, Mason said. She looked at him. And there it was between them again. That particular density, that weight of things that were true and acknowledged and moving, slowly, at the speed they moved, which couldn't be hurried without breaking. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not a grand gesture, just her hand on his arm, briefly, while he drove. Real and warm and without agenda. He didn't take his eyes off the road, but he felt it the entire way home. Daniel Hartley called again on the last day of March. Emily took the call on the back porch, which was still cold but had afternoon sun on it, and she stood in the sun with her jacket on and her coffee going cold in her hand and listened to Daniel Hartley say the things he had apparently needed a long time to get to. He said he was sorry. He said it clearly, without the hedging language that apologies sometimes came wrapped in. None of the "I'm sorry if you felt" or "I'm sorry, but you have to understand," just the plain version. He said he'd made choices that had hurt her, and that knowing she'd gone on to trust a man like Victor Langford, at least partially because of what Daniel had done to her ability to trust her own judgment, was something he thought about. Emily stood in the sun and let him finish. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Daniel said. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter," she said. "It did. It changed how I moved through the world for years." She looked at the yard, the old trees at the property edge, the places where the ground was beginning to soften. "But I'm not in that place anymore. So, okay." "You sound different," Daniel said. "I am different," Emily said. "Good different?" She thought about it honestly, because it deserved an honest answer. "Yeah," she said. "Good different." She hung up and stood on the porch for a while longer, finishing the cold coffee. Mason found her there 20 minutes later, coming out with 2 fresh cups. He handed her one without a word and stood beside her looking at the yard. "Daniel," she said. "I figured," he said. He apologized. A real one. "How do you feel about it?" Mason said. Emily thought about that too. Gave it the space it deserved. "Like a door that was sticking finally closed properly," she said. "Not dramatic, just, it's done. It's a closed thing." Mason nodded. They stood on the cold back porch in the afternoon sun, not saying much, watching the old yard begin its slow, tentative movement back toward green. "Spring's coming," Emily said. 2 more weeks," Mason said. Probably 3. You never know in this county." "Sophie wants to plant something," Emily said. "She told me. She wants tomatoes." "She's never grown a tomato in her life," Mason said. "I know," Emily said. "I thought we could figure it out." "We." The word went into the air between them and stayed there, and neither of them took it back, and neither of them made it into a bigger thing than it was. It was just the right word, the true word. And the afternoon light came through the old trees and lay across the yard, thin still but warmer than it had been, and the house stood behind them solid and unchanged, and everything that had been building since October, slowly, imperfectly, at the only speed it could honestly go, continued to build. The tomatoes didn't grow the way Sophie had planned. This was nobody's fault in particular, and everybody's fault in general. Sophie had chosen a variety that was technically possible to grow in Millbrook County, but required more direct sun than the back garden got in the afternoons. Emily had researched this after the seeds were already in the ground and decided not to say anything, which was a choice that made sense at the time and made less sense 6 weeks later when the seedlings came up thin and pale and confused looking, reaching sideways toward the light instead of upward. "They're not right," Sophie said, standing over them with the expression of someone whose trust has been betrayed by nature. "They need more sun," Emily said. "You knew," Sophie said. "I found out after." "Did you find out before or after you decided not to tell me?" Emily looked at Mason. Mason looked at the seedlings. "After," Emily said, which was true, and also the kind of true that had some flexibility in it. Sophie considered the seedlings for another moment. "Can we move them?" "We can try," Emily said. They spent a Saturday morning relocating every seedling to the south-facing side of the yard, which required digging up what Mrs. Adler had previously established as her herb territory and negotiating a compromise that involved moving the herbs into containers on the porch. Mrs. Adler supervised this process from a lawn chair with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a woman who had accepted that her life was no longer entirely her own. The tomatoes, moved to better light, began to straighten up within a week. Not perfect, still a little leggy, still behind schedule, but growing. Emily stood over them one evening in late April and thought about how much of the good things in her life had that quality. Slightly off plan, a little sideways, arriving later than expected and more complicated than anticipated. The Community Center Grant Program, which had launched in March with Rosa's blessing and Mason's capital and the structural help of 2 colleagues he'd connected Emily with, had enrolled its first cohort of 12 families and was already messier than the proposal had suggested. 3 of the families had pivoted their business ideas after the first session. One woman had decided she didn't want a business at all, but needed the financial education to get out of a bad lease. And Emily had spent 3 hours on the phone with a housing attorney figuring out how to redirect the resources appropriately. Nothing was clean. Everything required adjustment. She wouldn't have had it any other way. The program was real precisely because it was complicated. Clean things, in Emily's experience, were usually performed rather than genuine. Mason came to stand beside her in the garden. "They're improving," he said, looking at the tomatoes. "Slowly," Emily said. "Sophie checked on them twice today," Mason said. "Before school and after." "I know," Emily said. "I saw her." They stood in the garden in the April evening, which was warmer than March had been but still required a jacket, the kind of evening where the light lingered past 7 and reminded you that summer was coming even if it wasn't here yet. "I want to ask you something," Mason said. Emily looked at him. He was looking at the tomatoes, not at her, which told her something about the difficulty level of what he was about to say. "I'm not going to do it right," he said. "I want to tell you that up front. I've been trying to figure out the right way to say this for a while, and I don't think there is one, so I'm going to say it imperfectly and hope that counts for something." "Mason," Emily said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not in the way that we've been not talking about what this is. I want you to stay because this is where you belong, and I think you know that, and I know that, and Sophie definitely knows that and hasn't stopped telling me since February." He finally looked at her. "I'm not good at this. I go under sometimes, into the work, into my head. I know that about myself. Claire used to surface me, and I don't entirely know how to ask someone new to do that, or if that's even fair to ask, but Mason," Emily said again. He stopped. "I already know how to surface you," she said. He looked at her. "I've been doing it for 6 months," she said. "You get quiet in a particular way. You start making very efficient small talk. You answer questions with single sentences." She looked back at the tomatoes. "I just wait, and then I say something real, and you come back." He was quiet for a moment. "That's simple," he said. "That's simple," she said, "although I'd appreciate you knowing you do it, so we can talk about it." "I know I do it," he said. "I don't always know when I start." "I know," Emily said. "That's why it's useful to have someone watching." The garden was quiet. Somewhere in the house, Sophie was doing homework with the TV on in the background, a habit that Emily had mostly stopped arguing about because Sophie's grades were fine and the argument wasn't worth the energy. "I'm scared," Emily said. "I want to say that because I think I owe you the truth of it. I'm scared of needing someone this much. I'm scared of building something and then losing the shape of it." She pressed her lips together. "I've lost the shape of things before." "So have I," Mason said. "You lost Claire," Emily said. "Yes." "And you're not scared?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm scared differently than I was," he said. "When Claire died, I learned that the worst thing can happen and you keep going, which is both reassuring and horrifying, depending on the day." He paused. "But yes, I'm scared. I'm scared that I'll go under at the wrong moment. I'm scared Sophie is going to need things I don't know how to give her. I'm scared that you spent years being controlled by men who needed you to be less than you were, and that I won't, that I'll fail you somehow in ways I can't see yet." Emily turned to look at him fully. "That's a very honest list," she said. "You asked," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The April evening light was doing that particular thing it did in the countryside. Golden and direct, the kind of light that doesn't flatter so much as illuminate, the kind that shows you what's actually there. "I want to stay," Emily said. Mason exhaled. One slow breath. "But I want it to be a choice," she said. "Not a momentum. Not a thing that happened because I had nowhere else to go, and you had space and it all just drifted into permanence." She held his gaze. "I want to choose it." "Then choose it," Mason said. "I'm choosing it," Emily said. "I'm telling you I'm choosing it. That's what I'm doing right now." He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, just took her hand there in the garden in the April light, the way you'd take something that was already yours and had been for a while and you were simply acknowledging it. She didn't pull away. They stood there until Sophie opened the back door and said, "Are the tomatoes better?" And both of them said yes at the same time, and Sophie looked at their joined hands with the satisfaction of a person whose predictions have been confirmed and said, "Finally," with 9-year-old directness, and went back inside. "Finally," Emily repeated. "She's been waiting," Mason said. "Since when?" "She told me in January," Mason said. "She said, and I'm quoting exactly, 'Dad, are you going to say something, or am I going to have to say it for you?'" Emily covered her mouth. "What did you say?" she managed. "I said I was working on the timing," Mason said. "It's April," Emily said. "I said I was working on it," Mason said. She laughed, the real laugh, the one that surprised her, and he watched it happen the way he'd been watching it happen for 6 months. That particular transformation, the way her whole face changed when something genuinely got to her, the way it had never once stopped being something he was glad to see. The grant program's first success story came in May. Her name was Yolanda Ferris, and she was 38, and she had been thinking about opening a small alterations and tailoring shop for 11 years. Not 11 months. 11 years. She had the skills. She'd been doing alterations out of her apartment for 2 decades, for neighbors and friends, and eventually friends of friends. At rates she charged because she felt guilty charging market rates, because who was she to charge market rates? She was, as it turned out, very good. Emily had figured that out in the second intake session, when Yolanda mentioned offhandedly that she'd reworked a vintage wedding dress for a customer who'd cried when she put it on. The way Yolanda said it, without pride, just fact, was the tell. People who were genuinely skilled at things often said them like facts. Emily had helped Yolanda build the business plan over 6 weeks. Budget projections, pricing that reflected actual market rates, a location analysis for 3 possible storefronts in Millbrook's commercial district. The grant, $1,800, covered the security deposit on the smallest of the 3 spaces, a narrow shop on a side street that got good foot traffic from the salon 2 doors down. Yolanda opened on a Tuesday in May. Emily drove there on her lunch break and stood outside the shop, which had a hand-painted sign in the window that said Ferris Alterations and a display of a few pieces Yolanda had made, a jacket with intricate lapel work, a dress with the kind of seaming that made you look twice. Through the window, Emily could see Yolanda at the back counter, talking to a customer. She didn't go in. She just stood there for a moment. Rosa appeared beside her. Emily hadn't heard her coming. "She called me this morning," Rosa said. "First day. She already has 3 appointments booked." "Good," Emily said. "The woman she's talking to in there walked past, saw the jacket in the window, and came in," Rosa said. "Off the street, day 1. Emily nodded. She could feel her throat doing something she wasn't going to do anything about on a public sidewalk. "You built this," Rosa said. "Yolanda built this," Emily said. "She had it the whole time." "Because someone showed her she did," Rosa said. "That's not nothing, Emily." Emily looked at the shop. "No," she said, "it's not." They walked back to the community center, and Rosa didn't say anything else about it, which was the right call. Some things didn't need to be discussed past their natural stopping point. By June, the program had graduated its first full cohort, 12 families, 9 business plans, 3 redirected into other kinds of financial stabilization that weren't business ownership but were equally meaningful. Yolanda's shop was doing well. A man named Pete Okafor had used his grant to buy equipment for a landscaping business he now ran with his 2 oldest sons. A young woman named Kara Singh had used hers to complete an online certification she'd been unable to afford, which led to a job offer that tripled her income within 60 days. Emily kept a running record. Not for Rosa, not for the program's reporting requirements, but for herself. A list in the good leather notebook that Mason had given her at Christmas, the one she'd been filling page by page since October. Names and outcomes and the specific moments when she'd seen something shift in someone, when the shame lifted and the capability became visible. She showed it to Mason one evening. He sat at the kitchen table and read through it carefully, the way he read things, actually reading, not scanning, turning back to check something she'd written earlier. It took him 15 minutes. When he looked up, his expression was the one she'd learned to read as something got through the managing. "This is remarkable," he said. It's just notes, Emily said. It's not notes, he said. It's evidence. He looked back at the notebook. You should send this to Patricia. Why Patricia? Because Patricia has contacts at 2 philanthropic foundations, and she's been asking me for months if I have anything worth their time, Mason said. This is worth their time. Emily looked at the notebook. It's just 12 families, she said. It's 12 families this cycle, Mason said. With the right funding, how many next cycle? Emily thought about it. 25, maybe, she said. If we expand the intake capacity and hire someone part-time to help Rosa with administration. And the cycle after that? She was quiet. You know what it can be, Mason said. I can see it on your face. I don't want to get ahead of it, Emily said. I don't want to plan something big and then have it fall apart. Emily, Mason said. She looked at him. You've been afraid of wanting things for so long that you've gotten conservative about it, he said. Not careful, conservative. Those aren't the same thing. The word landed accurately. She sat with it. You're right, she said. I know, he said. He handed her back the notebook. Send it to Patricia. Let someone else tell you what it's worth and then decide if they're right. She sent it to Patricia the next morning. Patricia called 4 days later and said 3 things in sequence. That the notebook was extraordinary, that she wanted to introduce Emily to a woman named Helen Cho, who ran a foundation that funded exactly this kind of work, and that Emily should prepare a proper proposal because Helen moved fast when she found something she believed in. Emily wrote the proposal over a 2-week period, mostly at the kitchen table after Sophie went to bed, with Mason working in the chair across from her on his own things, the quiet companionship of 2 people who had gotten used to sharing a working space. He read drafts when she asked him to. He didn't suggest changes unless she specifically wanted them, which was a form of respect she'd stopped taking for granted after the first time she asked him, and he actually just listened instead of redirecting. Helen Cho met Emily for coffee on a Thursday in early July. She was 60, slight, with the direct gaze of a woman who had been evaluating things for a long time and had gotten efficient at it. She asked Emily questions for 90 minutes, hard questions, the kind that required specificity, not philosophy. What were the failure rates? What happened when a business plan didn't work out? How did Emily measure impact in cases where the outcome wasn't a business launch? What was the program's theory of what was actually wrong and what would actually fix it? Emily answered all of them, directly, without padding. When it was over, Helen said, I want to fund this. Not the small version, the real version. 25 families a cycle, 3 cycles a year, with the administrative infrastructure to do it properly. I want to fund 3 years. Emily looked at her across the coffee cups. What do you need from me? Emily said. A director, Helen said. This program needs someone running it full-time who is not Rosa, because Rosa is already running 3 other things and is going to burn out if we add to it. I'd like that person to be you. The coffee shop was doing its ordinary midday business around them. Emily heard the espresso machine, someone's phone ringing, a child at the next table negotiating with a parent about something. The ordinary sounds of the world continuing on. I'm not a nonprofit executive, Emily said. No, Helen said. You're better. You're someone who actually understands what you're trying to do and why. She leaned forward slightly. Emily, I've funded 12 programs in 7 years. The ones that work aren't run by executives. They're run by people who can't stop thinking about the problem. Emily drove home with the windows down and the July air coming through, and her hands on the wheel very steady. She was 31 years old. She had arrived at a billionaire's gate in a ruined wedding dress in October with nothing but one shoe and a decision she'd made in a church vestibule because the music had started and she couldn't go through with it. And here she was. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment. Here she was. Mason was on the porch when she got out of the car. He was on the phone, but he looked up and whatever he saw on her face made him say something brief into the phone and hang up. Well, he said. She wants to fund 3 years, Emily said. Full scale. And she wants me to run it. Mason was quiet for a second. What did you say? He said. I said, I needed to think about it, Emily said. I said it to be professional. I don't need to think about it. You're going to do it, Mason said. I'm going to do it, Emily said. He came down off the porch, and he did something he didn't do often. He pulled her in and held her, right there in the driveway, without preamble or ceremony. Just held her, and she let him, her face against his shoulder, and for a moment everything that had happened from October to July lived in her chest all at once. Not painfully, just fully, the whole weight of it. You did this, he said quietly. We did this, she said. All of us. He didn't argue with that. Sophie appeared at the front door. Why are you hugging in the driveway? Celebrating, Mason said without letting go. What happened? Sophie said. Emily got a very important job, Mason said. Sophie came down the steps. She looked at Emily's face, which Emily knew was doing the thing. The tell Sophie had identified months ago, the specific expression. Good important or bad important? Sophie said. Good, Emily said. Very good. Sophie considered this. Then she went back inside and they heard her very clearly say yes to nobody in particular, with the full conviction of someone whose preferred outcome had been confirmed. Mason and Emily stood in the driveway. She's been rooting for you since October, Mason said. I know, Emily said. She told me. When did she tell you? About 3 weeks in, Emily said. She told me I should stay forever and then said she knew I couldn't stay forever, just for a long time. She paused. I didn't know then if she was right. Are you right now? Mason said. She looked at him. The July light was long and gold, and it was the kind of evening that made Millbrook County look like the kind of place you'd invent if you were inventing a place to stay. Yes, she said. He proposed in September, not in a restaurant, not with an audience, not with a production. It was a Sunday morning, early, before Sophie was up, and Emily was in the kitchen making coffee and not thinking about anything in particular, and Mason came in and stood across the kitchen from her and said, I have something for you. She looked up. He put a ring on the counter between them. Small diamond, simple setting, nothing that announced itself. It was the kind of ring that had been chosen by someone who knew the person he was choosing it for didn't want to be announced at, who wanted something real rather than something impressive. I'm not going to make a speech, Mason said. You know everything already. You know what I am and what I'm not, and how I go under sometimes, and that I'm still figuring out how to be the right kind of father, and that I don't say the big things easily. You know all of it. Emily looked at the ring on the counter. I do know all of it, she said. I want to keep choosing you, Mason said, every day. I want that to be a thing we do on purpose. She picked up the ring. It fit, which shouldn't have surprised her, but did, a little. Yes, she said. Just yes? He said. Just yes, she said. You said no speech. He almost smiled. Then he did. She came around the counter and kissed him in the kitchen in the early morning light, and it was not like the kisses in stories. It was real, meaning it was slightly imperfect, meaning she bumped his chin with her nose and laughed, and he caught her face in his hands and they just stood there for a moment, foreheads together, in the ordinary kitchen of the house that had started to be home 7 months earlier on a stormy October night. Sophie found out 20 minutes later when she came downstairs for breakfast and saw the ring. She looked at it, looked at both of them, looked back at the ring. Finally, she said, for the second time since April, with the same satisfaction, and went to get herself cereal. They got married in May of the following year. Not a large wedding, not a production. 30 people in the back garden of the house, which by May had recovered from the tomato incident, and was properly green in the way that Millbrook County gardens got in May. Not the suggested green of April, but the actual committed green of a place that had made a decision. The tomatoes, for the record, had succeeded the previous summer. Imperfectly. They'd come in late and uneven, and several of them had split from irregular watering, and one of them had been claimed by something before they could pick it. But the ones they did pick were real tomatoes, grown from seeds that had been moved once and given a second chance. And Sophie had eaten one directly from the vine in the garden with the expression of someone who had accomplished something and was not going to downplay it. The ceremony was conducted by a friend of Mason's who'd gotten ordained for exactly this occasion, and it was brief because both Mason and Emily had agreed separately that ceremonies were generally too long and had then discovered they agreed when they sat down to plan it. Emily wore a dress that was not white. It was deep green, the color of the inside of an old forest, and she had bought it herself from a woman in the city who made them by hand. It cost money that was now hers to spend, from a salary she'd been drawing for 6 months as the director of what was now formally called the Millbrook Family Forward Initiative, which was an ungainly name that Rosa had suggested, and everyone had grown into. She did not have a maid of honor. She had Rosa standing near her, and her mother in the front row, and Mrs. Adler somewhere behind them doing something with her handkerchief that she would have denied if confronted. Mason was wearing a suit that fit him, which seemed like a basic statement, but which Sophie had enforced because the previous suit had a lapel situation she found unacceptable. Sophie was the flower girl, a role she had accepted with more dignity than enthusiasm, and she distributed petals with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to get to the next part. When Mason and Emily stood across from each other in the back garden of the house on a May afternoon with 30 people watching, Emily thought about the things she might say and couldn't find the words for them, and then found that she didn't need the words. That the words were beside the point, that the point was standing right in front of her with his organized interior and his tendency to go under, and his daughter, who asked about ocean crime, and his dead wife's book still on the library shelf, because some things you keep. She thought about October. She thought about the vestibule and the music starting through the door. She thought about the rain and the guardrail and the headlights coming toward her through the dark. She thought about what she'd told her mother when she came home with the loan release documents in March. I found something. I'm not going anywhere. She had found something. She had found several somethings, actually. A community of people she was trying to help. A woman named Rosa who ran toward problems. A 9-year-old who checked on tomatoes twice a day. A man who stopped when things moved in the rain. She had found herself, which was the one she hadn't been looking for because she hadn't known she was lost in quite that specific way. The ceremony was 17 minutes long, and then it was done and they were married, and Sophie threw the remaining petals up in the air because she had some left over and it seemed wasteful not to. 2 years after the wedding, the house was different in the ways that houses got different when they were fully lived in. Sophie was 11 and had graduated to a newer, slightly less embarrassing stuffed animal situation and had joined the school's science club and had recently announced her career pivot from marine biologist/detective to environmental lawyer, which Emily told her were not mutually exclusive either, and Sophie said she knew, obviously, which was becoming her primary mode of communication. Margaret Carter came for dinner on the second Sunday of most months. She and Sophie had developed a relationship that operated on a different wavelength than Sophie's relationship with either of her parents. They played cards together, long games with complicated rules that Sophie had apparently taught her grandmother and that nobody else was allowed to join. Margaret had, over the months, become someone Emily could call without the stiffness of the old wound between them. Not simple exactly, but honest. They'd moved from the arrangement of mother and daughter into something closer to actual knowledge of each other, which was harder and better. Rosa hired a second program coordinator in the fall of the year Emily and Mason married, which meant Emily could start traveling to other counties to talk about the model. She went to 4 different communities in 18 months. 2 of them launched their own versions of the program. She kept the notebook habit, new notebook every 6 months now, always the same kind Mason had given her that first Christmas, which she'd told him once, and which he had therefore ensured was always on the shelf. He still went under sometimes. It still happened. The efficient small talk, the single-sentence answers, the particular quality of absence even when he was physically present. And Emily still waited, and then said something real, and he still came back. It wasn't cured. It was managed together, which was a different thing, and in some ways a better one, because it required both of them. He'd learned to tell her when he felt it starting, not always, not perfectly, but often enough that the periods were shorter and he came up from them less disoriented. "I'm going under a little," he'd say sometimes, the same way you'd say you were tired, and Emily would nod, and the naming of it did something that not naming it never had. Their daughter was born on a Thursday in November, 2 years after the wedding. They had not planned for a second child with precision. They had decided together on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, in the way they made most decisions, talking about it plainly, saying the real things, deciding. It had not been simple or fast, and there had been a loss earlier in the year that had sat in both of them for months and required its own kind of sitting with. But the November Thursday arrived, and with it, a small person who was immediately and clearly furious about the transition from one environment to another, which seemed like a reasonable response. Sophie met her sister in the hospital and looked at her for a long time with the expression she'd inherited from her father, the one that was actually looking and not just seeing. "She's very angry," Sophie said. "She just got here," Emily said from the bed. "Bear," Sophie said. She reached out one finger, and the small, furious person wrapped a hand around it with the reflexive grip of someone who didn't have opinions yet, but had instincts. Sophie's expression changed. "Oh," she said quietly, just to herself. Mason was standing at the side of the bed, and he put his hand on Emily's shoulder, and she leaned her head against his arm, and the hospital room held them all for a moment. The five of them, because Mrs. Adler was in the waiting room and had been there since noon and would not be moved. And it was not a clean moment. Nothing about it was clean. The lighting was hospital lighting, and Emily was exhausted, and Mason had been awake for 31 hours, and Sophie was still in her school uniform because there hadn't been time to go home. It was real. All of it was real. They named her Clara, not after Claire, but not after Claire either, and Mason had suggested it, and Emily had looked at him, and he'd looked back, and they'd understood each other in the way they'd gotten good at. Clara Sterling grew up in a house where the library still had her father's first wife's books on the shelf, and where her grandmother Margaret came for cards on the second Sunday, and where her sister Sophie talked about environmental law over dinner with the conviction of someone who had already decided, and where her mother kept notebooks full of other people's names and the things they'd made possible for themselves, and where her father sometimes went quiet in a particular way that her mother recognized and handled with the patience of someone who had been doing it long enough to do it without thinking. She grew up in a house that had been lived in, which is the only kind of house that's actually a home. There is no clean lesson in Emily Carter's story. She would be the first to say so. She didn't run from her wedding because she was brave. She ran because she was out of options, and the music had started, and something in her that was still alive refused the door. That thing, whatever it was, the instinct, the refusal, was not wisdom. It was survival. And survival is not the same as wisdom, though sometimes survival is what gets you to the place where wisdom becomes possible. She spent years giving herself to men who needed her smaller than she was. That's not a story about weakness. It's a story about what people do when they've been told long enough that their size is the problem. You manage yourself down. You take up less space. You tell yourself that's just the shape of things. The truth is a person's size is not the problem. It never was. Mason Sterling did not rescue Emily Carter. That's the other thing she would want said. He stopped on a road in the rain and offered her heat and a guest room with a lock on the door. He gave her the space to be whatever she was becoming without requiring her to be finished first. That's not rescue. That's just treating someone like they're worth the room they take up. He would say, if you asked him, that she did the same for him. That there is a version of a well-managed life that is very nearly indistinguishable from a closed-off one, and that the difference between the two is whether anyone can still get in. He'd been managed so long he'd lost track of which it was. Sophie, if you asked her what she thought the story was about, would tell you she wasn't there for most of it, and so she could only report what she saw, which was, her father started laughing more, Emily made good eggs, and the tomatoes worked out eventually, which is, honestly, a reasonable summary. On the anniversary of the October night, the first anniversary, the one that fell during the year Emily and Mason were engaged, she drove out to that stretch of road by herself. She didn't tell anyone. She just drove there on a Sunday evening in October with the windows cracked because the fall air was doing the thing it did in Millbrook, that particular smell of something ending and something about to go still. She pulled over on the shoulder where she'd been. The guardrail was still there. The road was just a road, ordinary asphalt, worn down the center from years of the same tires going the same direction. She sat on the guardrail. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel. Something more dramatic, maybe. But it was just a guardrail on a road. The drama had been entirely circumstantial. Without the rain, without the darkness, without the particular state she'd been in, it was just the side of a county road in October. She sat there for 10 minutes. Then she got up and drove home. Mason was in the kitchen when she came in. He looked at her and didn't ask where she'd been because he was good at reading the difference between things that required explanation and things that didn't. She came and stood next to him at the counter. "I went to the road," she said. He nodded. "It's just a road," she said. "Most things are smaller when you go back to them," he said. "Not everything," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not everything." Sophie called from upstairs something about homework, and Mason called back something about doing it herself. And Emily put the kettle on, and the house held the evening the way it had been holding evenings for a year now, imperfectly, with creaks and the particular sounds of old structures settling into their foundations, but reliably. Reliably was enough. Reliably, Emily had come to understand, was actually the thing. Not perfect, not cinematic, not the version of things where everything resolved cleanly and the wounds closed without scars, and the people you loved were never complicated or absent or imperfect in ways that required work. Just reliable, showing up, being where you said you'd be, the way Sophie had noted in her child's way that first year, with the seriousness of someone who had learned early that showing up was not a given. Emily Carter had run from the wrong life in a rainstorm in October. She had arrived, one shoe, ruined dress, at a gate in the dark at the end of a driveway she'd never been down. And she had stayed, not because the house was beautiful, though it was, in the way that things that are genuinely lived in are always beautiful, not because the man was perfect, because he wasn't, and neither was she. And neither was the 9-year-old who grew into 11 and who would keep growing into all the versions of herself she was going to be. She had stayed because she had chosen to stay. Because choosing, after years of being managed and maneuvered and arranged, felt like the most important thing, the most human thing. You run until you can stop. You stop where you can stay. You stay where it's real. That's all. That's the whole of it. Outside, the October night settled over Millbrook County, and the stars came out one at a time over the old trees and in the house where the lights were on, and someone was arguing about homework and the kettle was beginning to sing. Clara Sterling, 4 months from existing, was just beginning to be, and did not know yet that she was already loved. The rest would come. It always does.